Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, they're not, so,
It was very nearly a slip, Mr. Inder.
I was waiting for that.
Waiting for someone to have a wee chat to someone next to them, not realising they had their sound on.
Good morning, can you hear me?
Indeed.
Oh, great.
Yes, we can, thank you. Let's just get things underway. Kia ora koutou, good morning everybody. Just before we start, could we just, anybody that wasn't on our call yesterday, would they mind just turning their video on briefly and introducing themselves, just so that we know who's on our screens, please? There's a few names there that may or may not be familiar to us, so if you think you're new, that would be much appreciated, please.
Kia ora koutou, Kelly Bingham from Becca here. I'm just listening in on behalf of Joe Healy, who is otherwise engaged this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Bingham.
Yeah, kia ora, David Clee from Auckland Waikato Fish and Game, presenting ecological evidence.
Morning, Mr. Clee, thank you. That might just be about it, I think. All right, is there anything anyone needs to raise with us before we start, other than for us to note that we appreciate the cooperation of Regional Council and NZTA in terms of a bit of a timetable shift to make today work more efficiently. We're grateful for that, and other submitters should be aware that there's a revised schedule being distributed or about to be distributed, which sets out an indicative time frame, pardon me, an indicative time frame for the rest of the hearing. Is there anything anyone needs to raise with us before we start, please?
Just one thing, Mr. Chairman, Barry for APL. I just wanted to be completely open with you in relation to some press coverage. APL does have PR consultants, but they have not circulated anything to the press. So that you will have seen possibly articles in both New Zealand Herald and Stuff that appeared yesterday. Those were independently reported submissions and so forth, and not the basis of a press conference. More importantly, there was an interview screened last night on a thing called Face TV, which I'd never heard of before, but which is an interview of Craig Turner by a fellow called Kim Campbell, and it's at least 20 minutes long. That interview occurred several weeks ago, and Mr. Turner requested that he be consulted as to the timing at which it aired, but that was aired last night, obviously because it was newsworthy, without further reference to Mr. Turner. So I just wanted to let you know, sir, that one, that's available, and two, it was not in any way orchestrated on our part.
All right, thanks for that clarification, Mr. Berry. That's appreciated.
You got no worries from my perspective, Mr. Berry. I don't read social media stuff.
Yeah, nor do I.
Yeah. So yeah, and I didn't put anything on Facebook either. So you know.
Just as well. All right.
Mr. Turner was very clear that he wanted me to clarify that.
No, that's fine. No problem. And thanks for clarifying that.
So,
all right, thanks.
Our second effects witness is Robert Quigley on social impacts.
Thank you. Morning, Mr. Quigley. Just when you're ready, thanks.
So you can hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Robert Quigley. I'm a social and health research consultant on behalf of APL today. The focus of my work for the last 25 years has been to bring practical social research into decision-making forums, such as this. I won't read my evidence verbatim. Instead, I'll quickly review the points of contention between the social witnesses. We actually do agree on a lot, and that's set out in our joint witness statement, but unfortunately there are still a few areas where we disagree and we remain apart on a few issues. The first is methodology, the methodology that I've used in my SIA. We still do disagree on that. I'll start by saying that my methodology assesses the full implementation of the master plan, and this is actually to follow best practice social impact assessment. As Nick Taylor said, one of New Zealand's most prominent SIA practitioners and also the author of New Zealand's first SIA guide, he says to try and assess all possible options is an absolute fruitless exercise. Breaking the master plan into fractions, say assessing only half the housing or 1/3 of the industrial component, would dilute any consequent potential effects that I might find and increase the likelihood of finding neutral impacts. And finding neutral impacts is usually not particularly helpful for decision makers if they're interested in the full effects of plan change. Assessing multiple scenarios would also require even more assumptions than are typically used within an SIA. Such additional assumptions would be very easy to pick apart, and that would weaken the strength of my entire social impact assessment method. For example, why would I be assessing 1/3 of the industrial component and only half the housing when I could be assessing 2/3 the housing and 2/3 the industrial? And there'd be assumptions underpinning that, and the permutations that I'd have to assess would also be quite substantial. In total, the methodology I've used provides decision makers with an appropriate level of information to be able to determine whether or not the conclusions I've reached are actually plausible or not. And that is over the long term, because over the long term, a plan change is a long-term game. Finally, I've not assessed outcomes such as Ohinewai as a dormitory town, simply because that is the wrong end of the stick. Ohinewai becoming a dormitory town would be a finding. It is not the proposal being assessed. It's like going into any impact assessment, not just a social impact assessment, but any impact assessment, starting with the answer and trying to fit the method and the data to that. I'd also just like to be clear that Ohinewai becoming a dormitory town is suggested by Ms. Hackle and is certainly not the finding that I came to. I came to the complete opposite. The second point of disagreement amongst the social experts is around the staging of the social infrastructure build. And that's more recently been described in Mr. Oliver's evidence. In our social expert joint witness statement, we all agreed that the social infrastructure should match the proposed staging of the development. The social infrastructure should match the proposed staging of the development. Instead, now we're being asked to front load all of the social infrastructure right at the beginning and to not match the stage of the development. Also, we are not in disagreement about the adequacy of the social infrastructure. No one is saying that Central Park is rubbish or that the cycle lane is too narrow. Instead, what is in contention, as described by Ms. Healy in her Section 42 update, is the timing of the community and infrastructure. And in particular, there are three concerns raised: regular bus connections, open space provision immediately around the residential area, or alternate modes of transport connections to and from Huntly. So basically, it's about the bus service, the Central Park, and the Huntly cycle and walkway connection. In the scheme of what determines social well-being, these are absolute minutiae. The timing of a regular bus service, the timing of the provision of the open space that's immediately adjacent, and the timing of a cycleway. Humans are social creatures. We've been around for about 1 million years and we've developed over that time. Our well-being is determined by factors like whether or not we can provide for ourselves and our families. That's called employment. Our well-being is determined by factors like whether we have a safe place to be and to grow up. That's things like housing. Our well-being is defined by our ability to take on new information to adapt to changing circumstances. That's things like education. Education, housing, and employment are three of the biggest determinants of social well-being out there. Timing of cycleways, timing of open space provision right beside your doorstep, and a regular bus service, unfortunately, are not critical to our social well-being. These are the icing on the cake for a 21st century society. They are not key determinants. A little bit more on the regular bus service. As we heard from Mr. Inda yesterday, there is already actually a bus stop planned for the development, and it will be fully enabled for bus services. So whether a bus service occurs or not is actually a Waikato Regional Council decision. They run the regional bus service. And they actually already run a bus service from Huntly to Ohinewai every morning and back in the evening. So it's not even about whether it's possible or not, it's actually a scheduling issue. And the bus stop is going to be built in year 3, which is directly after the factory is built. So it's as early as it plausibly could be. And I think 3 years is long enough for someone to sort out a bus timetable issue. The completion of the walking and cycling link to Huntly is scheduled for year 5, 2 years after the start of the residential housing. This is a modest wait time for such a rare piece of infrastructure. Most communities in New Zealand, say Te Kaupara, say parts of Wellington City where I'm living, we don't have cycleways, and actually they're not planned for any time soon at all. Cycle lanes are a rare piece of infrastructure in New Zealand. And as I've said before, that type of infrastructure is not critical for social well-being. The social consequences of not having a cycle lane for 2 years are negligible. The building of Central Park is due for year 5, 2 years after the start of residential housing. Again, it's a modest wait time for such a piece of infrastructure, especially given most communities wouldn't expect one sitting on their doorstep. In the meantime, there is an existing open space provision at the primary school, which is a modest distance away. As I've said before, such open spaces on doorsteps are not a key determinant of social well-being. If it was, most of us would be in trouble because we don't have such high quality facilities immediately adjacent to our residential dwellings. The potential effects arising from timing and provision of open space would therefore be negligible. The third and final disagreement seems to be about the certainty around housing and the certainty around employment. I've seen no compelling evidence for me to change my conclusions on those outcomes. For housing, I restate my position that it's not best practice to SIA to assess the housing effects on comfort group employees, as suggested by Ms. Healy and Ms. Hackle. SIA typically looks at issues on surrounding communities, outside the fence, not effects on employees, effects that are inside the fence. If the commissioners were of a mind to value such evidence, we have heard from Mr. Turner yesterday. The certainty of a major positive social benefit arising from employment is also not shared by Ms. Hackle or Ms. Healy, despite the development contributing up to 2,600 jobs. And we heard from Dr. Wheeler that even a worst case scenario might be 1,500 jobs. These are massive numbers of employment. The literature around the social benefit arising from employment is unequivocal. You just can't argue on that stuff. And also the literature about the effect size of how good employment is for social benefit is off the chart good. So it's very, very high. So I stand behind my conclusion that employment from the master plan has the potential to make major positive contributions to social outcomes. So to sum up, the social experts do agree on many aspects, but to my mind, the areas we tend to disagree on are either minutiae or are pretty obvious from my perspective, and somehow we must be talking past each other. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Mr. Mark, do you have any questions?
Look, thank you for that, Mr. Quigley. You made it really simple and succinct to understand your thinking and how you determine what you've determined. So thank you very much. I have no questions.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions, Mr. Quigley. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kearney.
Yes, Mr. Quigley, you've been challenged that you should have looked at partial completion scenarios, and you've pushed back pretty hard on that. And you've said, well, no, that's not how you do it. You've got to look at the full proposal. What is generally best practice in this field?
As I mentioned, it's definitely best practices to look at the full proposal, because otherwise you simply dilute the solutions, the potential effects. It would be a classic way, if impact assessment was set up like that, you could quite easily rig the system to only assess partial developments to show that, oh, this part is a less than minor effect, and this part is a less than minor effect, and this part is a less than minor effect, and therefore all together it's a less than minor effect. So when we do an assessment, we typically take the whole thing together so that we get that cumulative type look at aspects. It's there to not dilute it, and it's there to give the best information to decision makers. I've written 3 guidelines, international and New Zealand based guidelines on how to do SIA. I thought I better not quote myself, so I went back to the very first original one by Nick Taylor's guidelines, and he's also clear that you do assess the whole thing. The only times you might assess something that's a little bit less would be if you were doing an options assessment, and that would be where the proponent had 3 absolute clear options that maybe they wanted to go with option A or option B or option C, and actually all 3 options are on the table. That is an example where you might do a full assessment across 3 options, but we haven't got that sitting here with us. Instead, we've been given one master plan proposal, and that is the piece of work that everybody is actively working to achieve. There's no one actively working to achieve a half a residential build or a third of an industrial build. So it's really important from a social impact assessment perspective, and in fact all impact assessments, that you assess the full plan. You don't see assessment of half the plan in the archaeology assessment or in the ecology assessment or the water assessment. And so the fact that they're asking for it in a social impact assessment seems quite unusual to me. We follow the standard impact assessment approaches that everybody else does.
All right. What about in this situation where you've got the district council's consultant planner saying, look, I don't agree with the housing component, but I agree that it should, the industrial component should be approved. What have you looked at the social impacts of that?
I haven't assessed that because, as I said, I didn't break it into clumps. I think if we did go down that route, that would be pretty disappointing from a social perspective. One of the things that we do try to achieve is, from social angles, is to live, learn, work and play in the same place. So we've got a really great primary school there. We've got space for an early childhood education centre to go in if required. There's good bus services to the secondary school. So the education's looking great. Work, obviously there's 2,600 jobs being right there, so you could walk and cycle to your workplace. There'll be a central park, there'll be places to play as well. So people who are living there won't actually have to get into their car 4 or 5 days of the week. If you take away the residential component, of course, everybody will have to get into their car to go and work there. And it seems to me that it's one of the things that the blueprint isn't quite getting right at the moment. Te Kaupara is a town that's got 2,200 houses consented for it, but it only has 370 jobs. And here's Waikato Regional Council also wanting to put in a place for just jobs but no houses. So it's like the whole concept is to try and segregate people from where they need to be. I don't understand it from a planning perspective, and that's their job. I can assure you from a social perspective, it's absolutely not a good idea. We want people to live, learn, work and play in the same place.
I think Future Proof promotes the work, live, play concept.
Yeah, they do, but I'm not sure if they actually are implementing it, I suppose. Like, you know, Te Kaupara has got 370 jobs and 2,200 consented houses on top of what they've already got there. So this, and then the argument that the regional council was putting forward is that they want to create an industrial hub where everybody has to travel. It doesn't sound like live, learn, work and play to me.
I think that's the district council's consultant, not the regional council, isn't it?
Regional council's consultant, I think, isn't it?
Well, we haven't heard from the regional council yet about whether they oppose the whole concept or just the residential. So
Yeah.
they're going to clarify that. Just moving on, what is so wrong with a dormitory town? It's been mentioned as though it's something that you never ever do or never set up. Tell me what's wrong with a dormitory town?
The simple way is probably as if I could describe the life of a family who live in a dormitory town. And this is actually the descriptions that I've heard around Te Kauwhata from principals, from people who live there, and also from the real estate agents who are selling the houses there. So the family will get up very early in the morning. They'll jump in their car, kids and all. They'll drive up to Auckland. They'll drop the kids that early morning school care. The kids will go to school. Mum and dad will go to work, and then the kids will go into after school care. Then they'll pick them up and they'll drive home again, and they'll get home and they'll put the children into bed, and that's pretty much their day. So quality family times in the car. There's no socialising in the local area. There's no shopping in the local area. Okay. There's no socialisation in the local area. Pretty much everything's done away. It's it's not a great space to.
Okay. You mentioned there were three primary considerations. One was education, one was housing. What was the third one?
Employment. Employment is number one, by the way. To be very clear, number one, yeah. And that depends on the financial income. So employment/income is the number one.
Okay. You looked at childhood services.
Yes, so early childhood education, a neutral to moderate positive effect, but also all sorts of social and health services as well, primary schools. So all of those were considered in the original social impact assessment. And
was that positive or negative?
So the moderate positive for, minor positive for primary schools, moderate positive for secondary schools. The secondary school component's been, since my social impact assessment, has been bolstered by the School of Tertiary Studies, which they're suggesting for the kids who are struggling at schools. Early childhood was minor positive. MSD was, they deal with the most challenged children in the area. They were also positive from that perspective. Wāhi whānui were related positive. So yeah, it's generally all around a really positive development. I work on a lot of developments. It's actually quite nice to be working on one where I'm not having to talk to people about how difficult it will be from a social perspective.
You looked at businesses in Huntly and Te Kauwhata?
Yeah, a very large number of businesses. I talked to over 107 different organisations and people in Huntly, Te Kauwhata, Rangireiri, Ohinewai. I think there was about 20 businesses in Huntly and Te Kauwhata. They're really positive about it. They see the potential benefits from the people who are employed by this plant, and because it won't be a dormitory suburb, those people are much more likely to live local. People don't want to live in Auckland and drive down, as we heard from Mr. Turner. They actually do want to live close to their job. It's much better for their quality of life, and so they will. It increases the likelihood of them supporting those local businesses, and they can see that.
You looked at the community board as well. You talked to the community board, did you?
Yeah, so at least a couple of members from the community board for Huntly, the Ohinewai area committee, and Te Kauwhata has a slightly different community board set up, but I think it was the chairman and the deputy chairman.
All right, okay. So you're saying you covered the field of those three primary considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk to every single primary school, every single ECE, every single secondary school. It's pretty hard to get principals to talk to you. They're all really positive about this for the educational outcomes in their region. They are really excited about their families living and working close to where they are, and they're excited about having a bit more income in those families.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Quigley. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Quigley. Just a couple from me. Were you here yesterday when Dr. Wheeler gave his economics evidence?
Yes.
He talked about and drew a distinction in economic terms between the benefits associated with acting and the disbenefits associated with not acting, and explained that they were different. Even though intuitively they might sound like the inverse of one another, they were different. Does that same situation apply in social terms?
I haven't thought of it like that, but I can very quickly. Yes, basically. So this is where it's important to understand the context of what is of the receiving environment. So Huntley and Te Kauwhara, in fact, the whole Waikato district is a low-income area. The household incomes are low on average across the district. Huntley has a declining population. Huntley has a declining number of businesses. It's actually pretty grim in Huntley. Lots of people obviously love living there, and they make it work for themselves. But compared with the rest of New Zealand, it's a tough place to grow up as a child. So when you're talking about bringing 2,600 jobs into an area, a low income area, where employment is not only is it difficult to come by, but the employment that you get is often quite low wage, and it's insecure employment. When you're bringing 2,600 permanent, reasonably highly paid job, the average salary is of 45,000, which is almost double the household income that is in this area already. Double. Might not sound like, 45,000 might not sound like much to you and I, because we earn a lot more than that, but people will snap these jobs up in this area. So the employment benefits are absolutely enormous, and it's really difficult for me to understand how that could possibly be turned away.
That's the benefits of acting.
Yeah.
But the converse of that is the disbenefit of not acting. And in economic terms, Dr. Wheeler explained to us that because the economy is not booming, because there's not something else that will replace this, he didn't use these words, but he said, I took from what he said is that this is an opportunity that is there. And if you don't grab it, it will be lost. It won't be replaced by something else. And so it's not just the benefits of the proposal that need to be considered. It's also the fact that the decline that you've explained in social terms, he used it in economic terms, will just continue. There's nothing to replace it.
Yeah.
Is
so
that?
Yeah, absolutely. The status quo is not actually sliding sideways, it's going backwards.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you.
And that's why the potential effects for employment, I'm still unsure how we managed to be talking past each other between the social experts about how it couldn't be anything other than a major positive social effect.
Okay, and I just wanted to also be clear, Mr. Cooney asked you in some detail about the industrial only proposition that if the district council's advice were to be accepted, would be the only thing that would be approved. As I understand it, you said, and I just want to be clear that I've understood you correctly, you've said you haven't considered that in an analytical sense, but that it would be a disappointing outcome because of the social benefits that would arise if you combined residential activity with that industrial activity.
That's right.
So the industrial activity would not be as socially positive in your mind as the integrated development. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yep, it's going to be a pretty special wee community there. The quality of life is looking pretty good. You know, like I said, a central park on your doorstep, cafes, access to wetlands, high quality new housing, a street layout. They've got transport hierarchies that support walking and cycling. A really great little primary school just across the tracks there. High quality jobs. It sounds pretty good.
My final question is, and it's really about where the distinction is between social impacts and physical impacts. And just using the example from yesterday from Mr. Inder when he was talking about the risks of cyclists potentially being in an unsafe environment if trucks came off the expressway heading south, crossed the centre line, and so on and so forth. Do you consider those sorts of things to be social effects, or do we put those simply, or how do we make sure we don't double count things and call everything a social effect?
Yeah. So in my scoping, I was very explicit that the potential health effects from getting knocked off your bike or being run over by a truck from the transport would be considered within the transport assessment, and that was explicitly so that I didn't double count things. Also, it's for me to do a really good understanding of the social effects arising from walking and cycling. I need to work extremely closely with those transport people, and to be honest, many of them are already very good at this. They're very good at walking and cycling, so I feel confident leaving that within their hands.
So when you look at that, how would I describe it, the cycle proposal that Mr. Inder talked about, looking at that from an integration point of view and creating that social link between the west and the east of the expressway.
Yeah.
Do you see that as being a social positive?
Yeah, I would. I was very pleased to see that, actually. I'm not sure if you were aware, but I think the very first early ones that I saw didn't have that link. And, you know, I've got primary school kids, sending them across that on a bike across those roundabouts would have filled me with dread. I don't think I would have sent them cycling. I know that some people did. Some people do. They've got higher risk thresholds than me. But from a social perspective, I think those sorts of components where you can support everybody of every ability to get around an area really helps. So instead of it just being the really confident cyclist, now you can send your 7-year-old child, you can send the mum can go down as well, and they can choose to scoot, they can choose to walk, they can choose to cycle. It's a really positive benefit.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Quigley. That's very helpful to us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Berry.
Thank you, sir. So our next witness is Ben Lawrence from Marshall Day on acoustic and vibration effects.
Kia ora koutou.
Morning, Mr. Lawrence.
Given that there aren't any points of contention or outstanding issues, I'll just summarise the key matters from my assessment.
That would be helpful, thank you.
So just on the existing environment, the western side of the site is quite noisy. This is due mostly to State Highway 1 and the North Island Main Trunk Railway. But there's also regular traffic on Lumsden and Tahuna roads. And I'll just note that Lumsden Road already includes quite a few heavy vehicle movements. I just bring that up because there's been some discussion about truck movements yesterday. So the only other notable noise source in the area is the game bird shooting on Lake Rotokowo on the Department of Conservation Reserve to the east, which I'll explain a bit further shortly. The main noise producing area within the development is the industrial zone. So normal light industrial activities should be unconstrained by the noise limits, but I'll just point out that some mitigation and management might be needed at the zone interfaces between residential and industrial, which is normal practice. This includes noise barriers or building envelope design, just typical mitigation measures. And this is helped somewhat by the buffer included in the master plan between the residential and industrial zone. So overall, the industrial noise will be generally comparable to the existing environment, which is controlled by the transportation noise. Just regarding construction noise, most intensive works would be undertaken quite some distance from existing dwellings, but as Mr. Spate explained yesterday, the main ground improvement method proposed is dynamic compaction, which does generate quite high vibration levels. So activities like this will need to be mitigated and managed through a construction noise and vibration management plan. And we've worked on such a plan as part of the resource consent process for the foam and underlay plants. So the framework is already in place to control these activities to a reasonable level. And just on the game bird shooting, this matter was raised by Fish and Game during consultation. So I visited the site on the first weekend of game bird shooting this year, and sporadic shooting from the eastern side of the site was definitely noticeable. I assessed this in detail and worked with Mr. Oliver to come up with some controls to both solve the reverse sensitivity effects and also to ensure there's an acceptable level of amenity for the residents in the new residential area. So those controls are a no complaints covenant on the residential area, which solves the reverse sensitivity issue, and also a facade control for dwellings which are facing the Lake Rotokoa Reserve to ensure that there's a good level of internal acoustic amenity for those dwellings. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, Mr. Lawrence, just the construction and the compaction and all that sort of noise that you're referring to under the construction and the consolidation of the soils, that'll largely be done before much residential housing is there anyway, won't it be? I mean, by and large, that'll be out of the road before dwellings are being put on site, or very many.
Yep.
Is that be correct?
That's right, but there are some existing dwellings on the western side of Lumsden Road. So I was mainly referring to those, and also some on the southern side of Tahuna Road. So there's a small area of earthworks that will be nearby those receivers, and that's what I was referring to.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Mr. Mark?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Ben, can you just repeat what you said around reverse sensitivity and the game bird shooting issue?
Yes, so currently there's game bird shooting on Lake Rotokoa. That's to the east of the site. When the new residential development is constructed there, there could be effects on the game bird shooting from that new sensitive activity that's now right next to it. So to solve that matter, if there's a no complaints covenant on the residential area, then there shouldn't be any effect on the existing activity in the area.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you. Thank you.
Could you just explain a little bit, Mr. Lawrence, about the, you mentioned the construction management plan that that you've developed for the resource consent that's currently under consideration. Can you just explain a little bit about what its objectives are and what the performance standard, if I can put it that way, that it's designed to achieve?
Yes, sure. So there's two parts to it. There's noise and vibration. So noise is less of an issue here because most normal earthworks, there'll be some distance from nearby receivers, and it's a high noise environment anyway. So it's not hard to control that to a reasonable level, which is what the objective is of the noise component. For vibration, dynamic compaction is an activity of concern. It's one of the more higher vibration producing activities. So I'll break that into two parts. So first of all, the main concern is effect on buildings. So that's the existing dwellings on the other side of Lumsden Road. So there is a standard that we need to comply with there to ensure that we avoid any cosmetic building damage, and that relates to cracks in plaster or paintwork, so superficial damage. So we need to avoid that, and that's what Mr. Spade was referring to with that threshold, where we need to look at other options if that threshold is potentially exceeded, and that process is set out in detail in the management plan. The other part is effects on residents. So of course, if you can feel vibration in your property, you're likely to become concerned about that. This is addressed in quite a few ways. I would say the most effective way is setting up good communication, letting the residents know when it's going to take place, trying to schedule it when they're not at home, and basically informing them of what those vibration levels mean in the context of, effects on their dwelling, and sort of addressing those concerns by giving them information. The other measures to control vibration to a reasonable level for people are looking at different options where they're practicable. This might be increasing the area that the alternative ground improvement measures are used within, just extending that area a little bit, or dropping the weight from a lower height to reduce the vibration levels. So there's basically a toolbox. The management plan is a toolbox, really. It has a whole lot of solutions that you can choose and tailor to minimize effects on those residents. And monitoring is a key part of that. So the management plan says to monitor high noise and vibration activities. So an acoustic consultant will be on site to make sure it is as it was predicted to be, and if any additional measures are needed. So it's a really good, when it's implemented properly, it's a really effective measure for controlling noise and vibration effects from construction to a reasonable level.
Is there, I mean, you mentioned about a vibration standard that's to be achieved, and that, generally speaking, is designed to ensure that buildings don't crack and plaster doesn't crack and so on and so forth. Is there a similar amenity-based standard that applies to the earthworks type of thing from an amenity point of view? E.g., it's not breaking the building, but it's annoying to the point that you get hosed off with it?
Yes, there's a range of different thresholds. What is applied in Auckland is 2 millimeters per second, and that's compared to 5 millimeters per second, which is the building damage.
Building standard, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of where the effects start, so you can feel vibration at 0.3 millimeters per second. At 1 millimeter per second, you start to wonder about it, I suppose. And at 2, that's really the threshold of when you start to think, is this damaging my building? That feels like a lot of vibration. So we've applied the 2 millimeters per second threshold for our assessment, and
that's where I was trying to get to. I was going to ask you exactly what the number was, but so there is a number for that, and that's what your management plan is designed to achieve.
That's right.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. That's very helpful. Much appreciated. Mr. Berry.
So we move from noise to landscape assessment. The next witness is Michael Graham, who will address landscape and visual effects.
Good morning, gentlemen. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Very
morning.
good.
Morning, Mr. Graham.
Good morning. If you're agreeable, I'll just launch straight into the revision of my summarised evidence in terms of just keeping it brief.
Thank you.
So I undertook a visual and landscape assessment of the development, and my findings basically drew on the visual amenity effects having a reasonably wide range from high, from close proximity locations, diminishing to very low to negligible once beyond the 1 kilometre distance from the site. Adverse effects on the existing amenity values were derived from the wider landscape patterns, and they were found to be acceptable as development will not be out of place with the wider landscape patterns. No adverse effects were identified on nearby outstanding natural features, that's Lake Waikari and the Waikato River. The Waikato River outstanding natural features considered sufficiently distant from the site and screened by intervening undulating topography, so it is not affected. A small portion of the site on peripheral planting of Lake Rodakawa, which forms part of Lake Waikari outstanding natural feature, is encroached on by the development slightly. The Ohinewai structure plan identifies this area as open space network, and it is anticipated that this part of the site will be enhanced with restoration planting. The master plan itself anticipates extensive mitigation and planting strategy, including planting setbacks between Lumsden and Tahuna roads. A wetland park is proposed for the eastern portion of the site, identified as open space network in the structure plan, and shown as planted in the planted parkland in the master plan, adjacent to Rodakawa. This will assist in both reducing the visual presence of the development on the adjacent rural land and potential sensitivity and reverse sensitivity effects between rural manufacturing, business and residential activities. I consider that the proposed planning framework for the site is appropriate and consistent with the intent of the relative objectives, policies and rules of the Waikato Regional Policy Statement, the future-proof strategy and the requirements of sections 6B and 7C of the RMA. That's a very brief summary. Gentlemen, if there's any questions that I can respond to.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Mr. Cooney?
I've got no questions, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, none from me, but thank you very much, Mr. Graham.
You're welcome.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions either, thank you.
No, and I have no questions either. Thank you, Mr. Graham. Thanks for your evidence.
Thank you very much.
So now, sir, the last of our effects witnesses is Chad Croft, who's an ecologist, and I think he's on the line.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
You're a little bit crackly and faint. I wonder if we might ask you just to turn your video off and see if that improves, or just, could you just say something else, please, Mr. Croft, just so that we can see if it was one off or.
Sure, yeah. I guess I'm not overly surprised that internet isn't the greatest, but I can turn my video off to give it a little bit extra balance.
Let's turn it off while you're talking and then maybe turn it on when we're asking some questions, just see how that goes.
How's that? Is that any better?
Marginal. Maybe turn it back on so that we can keep an eye on you, as it were.
Okay. All right.
And if we run into trouble, we'll just ask you to pause and go again.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize for that. Okay, so I'll just dive right in. In general, there's pretty solid agreement around all of the ecological values that are present and what those threats may be. Through conferencing, there were agreement on all the issues with the exception of a couple of the details in terms of how we would implement management, specifically around threats to the significant area, agreed significant area around Lake Rodakawa. So we agreed to work with Fish and Game to come up with a predator control program, specifically trying to manage the introduction of domestic pets, being cats and dogs. And through that process, we developed a couple of draft conceptual plans and provided to Fish and Game for input. We've yet to come to some resolution on what the specifics should be. We've presented a predator control program, which is primarily aimed at lethal control, as well as increased awareness and education. At this point, we're waiting to, I guess, further the discussion in terms of Fish and Game's concerns with that process or that approach. The only other aspect which was discussed and there was disagreement on was with regards to the classification of the drains and whether they were in fact artificial. It appears reading the Section 42 report and subsequent evidence submissions that the classifications of the drains are less contentious at this point, with the exception of the Tahuna drain, which I think was regarded as still in dispute in terms of whether it's in fact an artificial drain. I think that deals specifically with any of the outstanding issues that remain with regards to ecology.
All right, thank you, Mr. Croft. Let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Cooney?
Mr. Croft, a lot has been made of the black mudfish. First of all, what is it? How big is it? Is it can you eat it or what? What is it?
So it's a very unique indigenous fish, and it is quite small, in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 millimeters, and it's primarily unique because of its ability to live in very marginal habitats, and its ability to live without water for a long period of time.
It's never been found on this property, has it?
Well, we looked for it. We haven't found it. There's no historical evidence that it's been on the property before when we consult any of the existing information.
And
however, it is known to be located within the adjacent waterways.
And I think you're promoting a management plan that would help promote its identification and protection. Is that right?
That's correct. In my opinion, the best way to deal with it is through management, and that is assuming we do find it on site.
Okay. And at the moment, a farmer could go in there and just create he could create a much bigger impact than this proposal at the moment.
At the moment, yes.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cooney. Mr. Mark?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just on those mudfish, it's a modified site, anyway, isn't it? It's not in a natural environment, the property, apart from the wetlands, which are to the east. But the amount of mudfish that's likely to be there would have been pretty minute, and they would have been disturbed for many, many years anyway, wouldn't they? How big is this issue? I mean, I know it seems to be an emotive issue, and a bit like bats, it seems to be something that highlights pretty major emotional effect, but it hasn't got really much impact, has it?
So you're right, it is a heavily modified site. The drainage channels in which are on the site are artificial. So without the farming activity that's there, they wouldn't exist, presumably. Mudfish are unique in that they do, they're non-migratory, and so they tend to hang out in specific areas and not move around a whole lot. The uniqueness of that is, of course, if you do find them in one particular area, it could be a stronghold. But in this particular site, the access to the areas is limited because it is controlled through a pumping system. It doesn't have direct kind of connectivity to any of the natural systems.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Croft. Can I just want to, you've mentioned, and it's I think at paragraphs 5.9 through 5.13, if my notes are correct, you've talked about the survey that you've done on site to look for black mudfish. Well, not specifically, you've done fish surveys. And I think you said, well, I do know you've said because I'm reading it now, you've set a total of 23 G minnow traps and 3 fight nets. Is that a reasonable level of effort? I mean, you said that you'd gone out and looked for these. Is that the equivalent of sort of opening the blinds and having a peek through the window, or is that going out and doing a pretty forensic look to be satisfied that there's none of these fish there?
Good question. So we did 2 levels of intensity. One was, as you described, opened the blinds and took a look across the wider site. And then for what was considered stage 1 in the foam factory, we did an intense investigation within the drains in that specific part of the property. And we followed some recommendations from WRC with regards to what that intensity should look like and duration, and we didn't find any in those drains.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Croft. Thanks for your evidence.
So that was the last of our witnesses dealing with specifically with effects, and we now move into the possibly the most contentious aspect as far as our principal protagonists are concerned. The first witness is Stuart Penfold. He will wrap up the effects part of the story, and then we'll have John Oliver. So if I could get Stuart on the line, please.
Thank you. If we could just hold fire too, so that we can close this tranche of evidence that I've got stored in my system, so I can just open the right documents. Please just give me a minute. My searching, Mr. Penfold's about as fast as you're typing from the expert conferencing, so you'll just have to bear with me for a moment.
I was wondering when that was going to come up.
I thought I'd get in first. For those that are present during the expert conferencing, Mr. Penfold gratefully accepted the responsibility of being the scribe to record on the screen what was being said, but he was fired after about probably 3 minutes for
3 minutes.
Gross incompetence in that space.
Absolutely. Stage, certainly some stage fright there.
So just bear with me. Sorry, well, I shouldn't have been talking while I was looking for this either. All right, I'm good to go. Thanks, Mr. Penfold.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an abridged version, I guess, of my summary statement, given a very comprehensive evidence over the last day and a half. So my role is providing planning evidence in support of APL's rezoning. Just in terms of the context of the planning evidence, Mr. Oliver, who you'll hear from shortly, is undertaking, I guess, what I call the heavy lifting in terms of the planning policy and statutory framework, given its relatively complex nature. So my focus is really on the effects of the development that's enabled by the Ohinewai structure plan. And it's worth noting, there's been sort of 18 to 24 months worth of analysis and reporting for this structure plan. So it's good to hear from the experts over yesterday and this morning on the fruition of that. So my evidence has clearly set out the benefit of the expert caucusing back in June and the narrowing of the key issues. There's also been discussions with key submitters and so forth with respect to some of those key issues right up until the hearing. So that's been really helpful. I also note that throughout the caucusing and the evidence exchange process, there has been quite a high level of detail placed on certain matters. And this has been useful in some respects. But I mean, generally, we'd expect that sort of level of attention at resource consent phase. But I sort of hope that evidence has been useful in understanding the thoroughness of the approach of the experts. I guess one example of that is, as Mr. indicated yesterday, in terms of that southbound off ramp and the truck turning issue. I guess just to confirm that as part of the plan provisions, which Mr. Oliver will talk to in a moment, the requirement for an ITA integrated transport assessment is included in the proposed plan provisions at this stage. Now, if I could just briefly summarise the key issues in my mind: transport, wastewater and water supply servicing, ecology and pest control, and affordable housing. So these have clearly been identified in the expert evidence, and as a planning response, in my mind, none of these key issues preclude the rezoning as a whole, certainly when you account for the proposed plan provisions. And just to close off, in summary, turning to my summary statement, I have sort of listed off a number of plan provisions. So we've got the staging of transport infrastructure is pretty key. You know, we've got the proposed pedestrian and cycling overbridge, which it seems to have attracted some attention and by the agency and not being sufficient, which is quite surprising in my view, given that developers don't normally provide for such infrastructure straight off the bat. So I think Mr. Inder has certainly covered that off in terms of his expert evidence. The staging of wastewater and water supply infrastructure. I note that there may still have been some ambiguity yesterday, but essentially I certainly appreciate the Jim Bradley and Will Gauntlet sort of jumping in and sort of covering that off. And the plan provisions there are very clear in terms of restricting development until that is sorted. Mr. Gaze has helpfully outlined the commitment between APL and also the commitment shown by the Waikato District Council in terms of actually the providing for that infrastructure upgrade at Huntly, and the technical solutions are there. I think that's I'd like to think that that's been covered off. Mr. Croft has just covered off the ecological matters and the black mudfish substantially. I think that's well addressed. The pest control framework, I think Mr. Croft has clearly outlined that level of detail sought by Fish and Game is more appropriate at the resource consent phase, and that is, I agree, and that requirement is clearly outlined in the plan provisions. Stormwater management and flood risk, the expert evidence has clearly shown that's been addressed. And that goes for landscape effects and noise effects. And I also just acknowledge that, there's been a clear signal that, we won't be delving into the details of the plan provisions at this stage. So if the panel and commissioners were of a mind to approve the rezoning, that, there's a body of work to be undertaken. Thank you. Happy to.
Mr. Penfold, let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Cooney?
No, I've got no questions, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no questions, thanks.
Mr. Marg?
Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Penfold.
I don't have any questions either, Mr. Penfold, simply because I think we'll ask Mr. Oliver about some of the bigger picture items of the planning provisions, just to clarify what the intention of them is.
Absolutely.
So thank you for your evidence, and
thank you.
It's appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Berry.
Last, but by no means least, Mr. Oliver to address strategic planning issues.
Thank you. Are you able to, that's what I was going to work too far. Here we go. Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Good morning.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So, my summary statement can be taken as read. but I would like to highlight some key issues that are in contention, that are partially in that summary statement, but not all. And I'm also anticipating your questions a little bit.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Oliver. Would you mind swapping places with Mr. Berry for a moment? Because I think the microphone must be close to him because you're fairly faint compared to him. And either move the microphone just so that we can hear you clearly, please.
The microphone's actually to my left. Is that all? How's that?
That's better. If you don't mind, feel like you're shouting. That's clearer. Thanks.
Yes.
Sorry, you were saying you were anticipating some likely questions and then I interrupted.
A couple of questions, so I will comment on those. So the two issues that I'll anticipate. First of all, just some commentary on the NPS urban development and its comparison with the NPS urban development capacity, and also how that fits with the current RPS. So I'll comment on that. And the other issue that you raised in the opening was you asked a question that in the event that the Ohinewai structure plan was approved, how would the plan provisions look and how would they be dealt with in a way that they didn't, I guess, create unintended consequences for other decisions, I guess, just a summary in terms of what you were asking, I think. So I'll comment on that as well.
Thank you.
So I guess in terms of key issues, I think the first issue is actually referred to in paragraph 6 of my summary is around I guess the uncertainty or the risk of rezoning land with the current status of water and wastewater servicing. So water and wastewater servicing in the medium to long term is a matter that's dealt with in the Mid-Waikato servicing strategy, but it's not at a stage, obviously, where there are either services fully in place or funding commitments in place to deliver those. So my opinion on that is that in this situation where we are dealing with public sector infrastructure. So I guess that's the first point, is we're not talking about a private developer wanting to do their own infrastructure. We're talking about connecting to existing public infrastructure administered by Waikato District Council. So in terms of the risk around that infrastructure not being adequate or not being compliant or simply not being a long-term solution just seems to be, to me, to be extremely small. The Mid-Waikato servicing strategy has obviously been particularly helpful in terms of putting in place a strategy that Waikato District Council is now able to deliver on over time and within timeframes that will work in terms of the Ohinewai structure plan development. So the Ohinewai structure plan is roughly a 10-year development. We're talking about potential capacity-related issues around about years 7 to 9, basically. So, and my understanding is that there is no capacity issue with wastewater treatment. The capacity issue arises around years 7 to 9 with water supply, and even that issue is based on some assumptions around the relative growth rates of Ngarawahia, Huntly, and Ohinewai. So if Ohinewai grew fast, but Ngarawahia grew slow, then the potential is that you may not even meet that or reach that capacity at that time. So given the time that's available, the strategy that's in front of us, I think there's a very low risk now. I think that situation would have been different if we were dealing with a private approach to infrastructure, and I wouldn't be nearly so comfortable with it. And I guess in terms of policy, there are quite a range of policies in the RPS that refer to integration of development with infrastructure, and I think that makes it consistent with policy 6.3 in particular, which is coordinating growth and infrastructure. But I do want to acknowledge the position of Waikato Tainui on that water and wastewater servicing. So I fully understand their precautionary position around it. There's a very high degree of frustration within Waikato Tainui about the lack of delivery, I guess, on the vision and strategy over the pretty lengthy period, probably, 15 years since the River Settlement Act was put in place. And they're still seeing non-compliances and issues with ongoing difficulties. So I fully understand their position on that. My view is that in this case, the benefit is that we now have a collaborative approach between a very significant development with a very significant investment working alongside the council, the Waikato District Council, to address those issues. So I think there's a high level of confidence I have now that the outcomes of all that will be delivering on the vision and strategy. Obviously, this is not a consent process, so we can't guarantee that through design or consenting at this stage. But at the rezoning stage, I think that is that's an adequate position. So the second item that's contentious I wanted to comment on is the residential component. So the residential component, in my opinion, is a critical part of consistency with policy on one hand. And so when I talk about that, I mean consistency with future-proof, live, work, play, visit and invest are the elements in it now, not just invest, live, work, play as well. So it's very important that in terms of consistency with that, that policy, that all the elements come together in one place. That is supported now, I think, by the NPS urban development, which refers to well-functioning urban environments, not quite in the same words, but a very similar concept in terms of urban environments that function in an integrated way and are not single-use kind of developments out on a limb. So I think that the residential component is fundamental to delivery of or consistency with that approach as well. Second element I think that really supports the residential is actually the effects. So in my opinion, as a planner drawing together both the effects and the policy, it seems to me that it's critical to be able to gain the positive effects, the benefits, particularly the social and economic. And I think that Mr. Quigley very carefully described the social benefits. And I took from that it's fundamental that the residential component is a part of the delivery of those benefits. So it's both consistency with policy and also delivery of benefits, in other words, positive effects. Third point I wanted to comment on is the issue of the Waikato Expressway and whether the available capacity in the Waikato Expressway in this location should be used for some short local trips, as you've heard about. So in my opinion, this development is entirely consistent with the use of the Waikato Expressway and its purposes to support industrial development, economic growth in the in the sub-region, in fact in the region. So it's entirely consistent with that, and again, based on the evidence around the benefits, both social and economic. So the policies in the RPS tend to use the words protect. And in my opinion, if you are protecting, you're keeping safe from harm. So if there is capacity, then it is a good planning outcome to use that capacity to support this form of development, provided, of course, that you don't, by doing that, inadvertently introduce safety issues, for example. But I'm satisfied on the evidence of Mr. Inden, in particular, dealing with that residual issue around the interchange, that that those matters can be dealt with through a pretty standard consenting approach. So in my opinion, it is protected in accordance with policies, particularly 6.6 and 6.3 of the RPS refer to infrastructure. The fourth point I wanted to talk about is, I guess, just the implementation of the flexibility criteria in policy 614 and method 614.3, and whether they're satisfied. So I guess the first point about those is that although they're criteria, they're listed as criteria, realistically, when you actually drill down into them, a lot of them are actually based on consistency with the development principles. That's where the detail is actually in the development principles, which are principles, not criteria. So, and there are elements that provide a lot of scope for interpretation. And given that this is a flexibility criteria, it's not surprising that they are written in a way that provides room for interpretation and for bringing forward development or land, a land pattern that doesn't fit the RPS. So I guess I've had quite a lot of experience in applying these principles, these criteria and the associated principles. And it's interesting to me that through that process, there seems to me to be an increasing need to use them. And that's not a coincidence, because the land use pattern in the RPS was 2009. And obviously now, 10, 11 years later, it's really under pressure in terms of some very significant changes. So in particular, table 6.2, which is the industrial application table, those tables, I mean, those land allocation areas are now seriously out of date. There have been changes in the areas of two I've been involved in, have been 60 hectares into Rapa North industrial nodes. There's been about 60 hectares in Hautapu industrial node, which is an increase in that case of the industrial area. And there's been an area of 40 hectares in the Hamilton Airport industrial node, all either brought forward or added to those industrial nodes. So if you actually compare table 6.2 down to what's on the ground, it's looking completely different. I think the positive to take out of that is that the flexibility criteria have actually worked, and there have been ways through those that have resulted in good outcomes in terms of adding capacity and also responding to unanticipated development. So the Hautapu example actually has some similarities with Ohinewai, in that the driver for that was architectural profiles limited, a very large aluminium joinery manufacturer based in Hamilton, and 5 or 6 different sites wanted to consolidate together and get onto one site of at least 30 hectares. And so that developer actually looked at Hautapu, which is obviously just adjacent to the interchange near Cambridge. There's actually at least 30 hectares of land available and vacant in the Hautapu industrial node, but the landowner wouldn't sell. So on that basis, a private plan change was initiated to add 60 hectares to that node. So quite similar from the point of view that it was unanticipated, because it was a very large manufacturer, wanted to consolidate, wanted to future-proof their development for the next 30 years, room to grow, adjacent to an interchange. It has all the same, very similar elements to Ohinewai. I think as time goes on, I think there are just going to be increasing mismatches, is my view in terms of that. But at the moment, the RPS criteria, they're pretty daunting. But as I say, those proposals have made their way through them successfully. I think just in terms of just a couple of matters of detail around the interpretation of those criteria, particularly the interpretation of the development principles. So my evidence in chief is clear that they're not a checklist that you have to confirm compliance with everyone. You have to take an overall view of them and consider consistency and whether the development generally fits with them, whether they're applicable, some are not, and the language around the development principles, which talk about principles that should be satisfied, and should meaning you should comply with them unless there's a very good reason not to. My opinion is that in this case, the very good reason is the very significant economic and social benefits that come with this development. One of the issues that both Ms. Trenouth in the Section 42A rebuttal and Mr. Mayhew also in his evidence have suggested is that within those development principles, some are more important than others. And so the ones that have a strategic element to them should take precedence over others. So I don't agree with that. Well, it's a matter of interpretation. The RPS actually includes in Section 2, under its interpretation section, it actually says that all items in numbered lists should be considered equal. So I don't think you can cherry pick. I think you have to take them all together. Within those development principles, because they reflect future-proof from 2009, 2010, there's definitely an emphasis on I guess an acceptable emphasis on concentrating, agglomerating development within urban areas, within urban limits, and so I'm supportive of that. I think that's correct. But I think what I'm seeing now, and particularly in the NPS urban development, is there is now a two-pronged emphasis on urban growth, and so it's not just consolidation, compact living, intensification, which was very much the flavour of those development principles and future-proof. It's now also growing out, so it's up and out. and those are terms used in the NPS urban development. So to me, that out aspect is perhaps not as strongly reflected in the development principles as it probably would be now if you were preparing development principles under the current NPS regime. So just turning now to the NPS urban development. Obviously, it arrived on our laps quite late in the piece, 20th of August. So I think all the planners have limited time to get their heads around it and what it means. So I guess from high level, in my opinion, obviously the question is, does the Ohinewai structure plan give effect to the NPS urban development? In my opinion, it does. And I think the key difference between the NPS urban development and the NPS urban development capacity is around the responsive planning approach. So it's got a direct policy on responsive planning, which the NPS urban development capacity did not have. The other thing that the NPS urban development does is it refers to considering a significant additional development capacity. So it uses the term significant additional development capacity, which suggests to me that that it has a different angle in terms of seeking to see some large-scale change in response to either predicted growth or unanticipated growth. And so you can kind of contrast that with the statement in the NPS UDC, which says along the lines of providing sufficient development capacity. So that's in the statement of national significance. I think it's sometimes forgotten or perhaps overlooked that the NPS UDC did actually have a responsive planning objective, which was OC2. It's basically that local authorities adapt and respond to evidence about urban development in a timely way. So that's been there for obviously since 2016. And I think it's reflected now. It's not reflected in the RPS, but it is reflected in Future-Proof 2017 in their section 7.5, which specifically refers to responsiveness to identified opportunities, significant identified opportunities for economic growth and development. So that's kind of got a bit of a match, but the NPS UDC didn't translate it into a policy. And so, in my view, the NPS UDC has done a good job in directing and, I guess, guiding councils towards a much more careful, qualitative approach to development capacity, both housing and business land. And so councils have generally picked that up pretty well. And so there's now a much better understanding of what is out there. But because it didn't have any particular policy or particular direction around that responsiveness objective, I think it's been overlooked. And the difference, obviously, with the NPS urban development is that it has picked up a policy. It's got a similar responsiveness objective, which is objective 6. But the difference is it's translated into a very specific policy. That's policy 8. And so it requires decision makers to be responsive to plan change that would add significantly to development, and that it specifically then itemises situations that it should address and unanticipated by RMA planning documents or out of sequence with planned land release. So those unanticipated and out of sequence are exactly the issues that in planning terms in the Waikato we've been grappling with through these amendments to the, or these challenges, I suppose, to the land use pattern that's in the RPS currently. The other thing the NPS urban development capacity does, it does require RPSs to include a criteria for addressing what adding significant development capacity means. So that suggests to me that there will be subsequent need for RPSs to pick up that very specific point and consider what it actually means in the context of their region.
It's UD, not the UDC.
It's in the NPS urban development. So anything like that was not included in the NPS UDC. So I'll just conclude on a couple of things. So I suppose, I guess the next point is maybe just to talk briefly about the plan provisions and that particular issue around how this might work. So when the plan provisions were drafted, they were drafted so that they were as self-contained as possible, and tried to avoid any implications for the balance of the proposed plan. So they do, they only insert one objective into the into Chapter 4, the urban environment, to specifically recognise Ohinewai, much the same way as that in that chapter other urban areas are identified. And then there are 10 supporting policies that run with it. And then the next step was to identify the Ohinewai structure plan as a specific area, and then have a specific set of rules applying to the Ohinewai structure plan at the end of the current chapters of residential, industrial and business zone. So that was broadly modelled on the lakeside to Kaupara. And then as a kind of a consequential amendment, there was a need to introduce 3 new road cross sections into the into Chapter 14, which is infrastructure and energy. So it's pretty minor. So although they were drafted to be relatively self-contained, they do adopt quite a number of the rules from other parts of the plan. So for example, permitted activities in the residential zone, some of those are cross-referred to in the Ohinewai structure plan provisions. So for example, they say permitted activities, several permitted activities are permitted, and permitted in the residential zone and also in the Ohinewai area, but new rules were introduced making, for example, marae complexes, pepakāinga, retirement villages and neighbourhood parks restricted discretionary activities in the Ohinewai structure plan area. So the issue with that is that if any of those adopted cross-referenced provisions are amended by other decisions on the proposed district plan, that would create a potential inconsistency with the Ohinewai structure plan. That assumes there are submissions on them, and I must admit I haven't done the exercise of going through and addressing what the risk is of that actually happening. I think you know, that can be done, but it may be just because of the nature of decision making on district plans. There may be consequential issues that are picked up, and there may be reasons to play it safe and perhaps not rely on any of those that haven't had submission on. So in order to avoid that unintended consequence of impact on other plan provisions, I think the solution would be to essentially take the provisions that we have developed and create a separate precinct, I guess is the word that's currently used in the National Planning Standards, suggested in the Section 42A rebuttal as well as the way to go, and I tend to agree. So an Ohinewai structure plan precinct that is completely self-contained in terms of all of its rules and all of its provisions. So that would mean that there's a kind of copy and paste exercise of taking a lot of those other provisions in the district plan and putting them into the Ohinewai precinct in such a way that they're completely self-contained. Or I guess they'd be ring-fenced, so then no unintended consequences. So the question then arises, so what impact could that have on development in Ohinewai in terms of, I guess, the potential mismatch that might occur between decisions that are made late 2021 on the balance of the plan and Ohinewai starting to develop into 2021, something like that. What are the implications of that? So I think my view of that is that the implications are quite modest because, as has been described in evidence, this is a 10-year at least development plan and will only be getting underway in 2021. And so if there were consequential issues that came out of the other decisions that needed to be revisited in the Ohinewai precinct provisions, that could be done through a variation at some point after that time to tidy them up, basically, and match them with the other decisions. Now, by that time, the majority of the Ohinewai development won't have taken place, and so there'll be ample time to get those provisions in place by the time substantial development happens in kind of year 2, year 3, year 4. So I think there's limited risk there, and I think it is certainly a doable thing in terms of creating a precinct. It will be a longer document than the current ones, particularly from having to include the district-wide provisions from Chapter 14. You probably need to import all of those into that section just to be safe, but it's certainly doable. I think just in terms of concluding, in terms of key issues, I think that as a planner, kind of taking into account all of the various strands of this development, I think a really important point is this is not a speculative rezoning. It's not a developer just wanting to sell land. It's actually driven by a key manufacturer, very much like that APL one, where there's a manufacturer with an urgent need to do something, and that's the driver. It's a single ownership, development at this stage, and so I think there's a much higher level, well, there's certainly a higher level of confidence that the proposal will take shape the way it's been described, supported by the plan provisions, but with sufficient flexibility, obviously, to deal with development and expansion issues as they occur. So it's very much, in my view, when you look at those issues and you think about it in Section 32 terms of perhaps not having absolutely every piece of information that you would have with it in a consenting process. You are weighing up, and I'm weighing up as a planner, the risk of acting versus not acting. So the risk of not acting, doing nothing, is that there are no benefits. And so in Section 5 terms, and Part 2 terms, those social and economic benefits, I think that are very significant, are not achieved. The risk of acting, what's the risk of acting and rezoning? There are some elements that will need to be dealt with over time, such as the plan provisions that I've just discussed, such as the staging of development, potentially delaying development stages if necessary to ensure the water and wastewater infrastructure is in place. It's not an absolute on any of those points, but in my view, weighing them up, it clearly lands on the side of acting in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. I think what we might do is take the morning break and come back at, it's been a bit of a long morning, so we make it 11 o'clock to give it a nice round number, and we'll adjourn till then. Could I just ask, as per yesterday, that if folk not log off, they simply mute their microphone and turn their video off. That way there's no reconnection issues when we resume. So we'll adjourn until 11 o'clock. Thank you. Well, so we're resumed. Probably got some questions for you, Mr. Oliver. Maybe we can start with you, Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Oliver. Just the S42 report writer and so on has recommended the residential part not be approved. The emphasis of what is being said here and by the regional council is that the residential should be taking place in the urban areas of Huntly and so on. Something that always comes to mind with me when I've been listening to this is that should that residential growth take place somewhere else, the water and wastewater issues are not going to go away. They're going to be the same, aren't they? Whether it's in one place at the APL site or the residential growth in Huntly would create the same problems, wouldn't? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's correct. Obviously, Ohinewai is close enough to Huntly to share the water and wastewater plant. So you're right, there would be no difference really in terms of those capacity or suitability issues in terms of those plants if development took place in Huntly.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. That's sufficient for me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Mark?
Kia ora, Mr. Oliver, and just following on from Mr. Fulton in relationship to the staged approach, it's clear to say that the stages will occur, and if we go back to Waikato Tainui and you, I guess, empathising with the concerns around the vision and strategy being given effect to, that would need to be done, and to, I guess, give certainty that the improvement to the health and well-being of the Waikato River and the waters that flow in are achieved before any next stage occurs. That's a safeguard that you've put in. Am I reading that right?
Yes, you are. Yes. So the water and wastewater consents have various renewal dates. So there are renewal dates for both the Huntly wastewater treatment plant and the Te Kaupara water treatment plant, and obviously the Huntly water treatment plants as well. So all of those renewal dates give everybody time to allow some development to put in place improvements and to, I guess, reconsent, if you like, those various discharges and water takes. So through that process, that's where the detail happens. That's where the design of those elements occurs, and the design obviously and the consenting for them will have to take into account delivery of on the vision and strategy. So that's the kind of process as I see it. The Ohinewai area will be developing, but at certain points those consents will need to be renewed and upgraded to meet the vision and strategy. And that's how it'll be delivered on.
Thank you. Not being an expert in the
sorry, Mark. Sorry, I thought you would, when you said thank you, I thought you'd stopped.
I just wanted to follow up on just some clarity
go if you like.
In relationship to the NPS UD, and obviously much reference has been made to it through the section 42 and what you've just provided us earlier, Mr. Oliver. And yeah, I guess I'm seeking clarity and some of the alignment with what APL has achieved and the work that's gone on so far, and particularly with working with iwi through the Tangata Whenua reference group, and then looking at the policy in relationship to giving effect to the Treaty of Waitangi and ensuring that in the decision-making process that iwi, hapu, mana whenua have been involved or engaged in the UDC. Fair to say you guys, through the proposition, have done that to date. Is that alignment, how would you put it, sorry, that alignment that's already been done by the proposition, that works in my view to giving effect to the NPS, would that be fair comment?
Yes, it does. So the NPS urban development, when its policy around planning decision, policy 1, planning decisions contributing to well-functioning urban environments. So a well-functioning urban environment must as a minimum, enable Maori to express their cultural traditions and norms. So in some ways that's a bit of a double up with section 6 of the RMA and various other things, but it's good to see it's right there front and centre. So I guess that's a good practice provision that's in the national policy statement now. In reality, Ambury is already well down the track with that. Been working on that basis all the way through. So I think that just reinforces that there's good alignment, certainly on that issue.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Cooney?
Yes, Mr. Oliver, what's the, you heard myself and Mr. Berry have a discussion about the difference between the NPS 2020 and the 2016, is it 2017 document? What from a planning perspective, what do you say is the difference between those two documents?
So I think as I outlined in my summary, probably the key difference is the responsiveness provision in the NPS Development 2020, which was, the policy was missing from the NPS UDC. So policy 8.
Yeah, it's a policy 8, yeah.
Do you... Yeah, it's quite neat, really, in terms of what it's, what it says. It has a number of issues around, how you apply it to different situations. For example, it says that in subsection B that the planned urban built form and those RMA planning documents may involve significant changes to an area, and those are not in themselves adverse effects. So that's in terms of urbanisation itself not being an adverse effect in terms of its form. So it doesn't specifically apply here, but it certainly is a new provision.
The planning sequence and the consideration of the various documents is when you start to track it through, it's not that complex, is it? And I'll just take you through what I've been looking at, and that is the RPS adopted the future-proof land pattern or urban areas or development areas back in 2009, was it?
2010, I think, yes.
And that RPS has an alternative land release criteria. So it actually provides for some flexibility.
Correct.
And all the planners agree, and they did at conferencing, that alternative land release criteria could be considered for this proposal. I think you all agreed on that.
Yes, that's right.
You're saying that those included in that land release criteria, those principles are not absolute.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? I think the word is should, isn't it?
It says
6A.
Should be consistent with.
Yeah.
So there's kind of two elements to it. So
it doesn't actually say that. It simply says new development should. That's the principles themselves.
Yeah, but the subsection in clause 6.14.3, which is the criteria for alternative land release, when it refers to development principles, it says the effects of the change are consistent with the development principles.
Right. Okay.
With
yeah.
Should.
Yeah. So your argument is, well, it's not absolute. Aren't the factors that should, in looking at the alternative land release proposals, because with the aging RPS, they become important. The factors that should be taken into account are the new NPS UD, shouldn't they?
Yes.
Or responsive approach. Is that one factor that should be?
Oh yes, it is. Sorry, I was just reminding myself of the policy. That's all. Yes, so I suppose you've got to overlay policy 8 over top of the alternative release criteria, which have been there for 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And it served their purpose, I guess, over that time, but there now seems to be a different flavour by saying in policy 8.
And you've got the age of the RPS. When it was last looked at, it was 2009. Since then, you've also had Future Proof 2017, which emphasises the need for flexibility.
Yeah, section 7.5 of Future Proof 2017 appeared to me to be a reflection of two things. One, experience in the Waikato that had been occurring up until 2017 of these unanticipated developments, and also, although it's not explicitly in there, it seems to me it's potentially a response to the objective in the NPS UDC 2016, which was current at the time, which does talk about responsive planning, the need for responsive planning.
Yeah. I think Mr. Tremaine in his brief refers to that factor, that it does provide for responsive. The 2017 Future Proof study emphasises that aspect.
Yes.
And you've also got the Waikato 2070 as well.
Yes, that's correct. So yes, that's a growth strategy, which is one of the relevant documents that's referred to in the RPS as a relevant document to be considered.
So all those documents and that sort of scenario should inform us as in the consideration of this proposal based on the evidence that we receive.
Yes.
The Waikato Regional Council says, well, this should be planned for due to the extent of this proposal. What do you say about that?
I would say that planning for something like this is, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's extremely difficult. Because if you say plan for something, you know, do you put it on a plan? Do you, do you have a spatial extent of it, or do you create a planning process that allows for it? So I think in this case, the reality is you can't spatially plan for it because it's an unanticipated development, just like the APL one was as well. And sometimes these things come out of left field. I think in terms of planning, a process to plan for it is a reasonable outcome. And I would say that currently the alternative release criteria do provide a framework for that. They provide sufficient flexibility as the planners agreed, but I do feel that now they're not as clear and perhaps as directive as I would expect given the national policy statement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. I've got a few questions of my own. Can I just, I could have asked this of Mr. Turner yesterday and I wasn't sure who to ask, so I thought I'd ask you, given that you've been at the pointy end of things. And you've been front and centre, haven't you, in the consultation with the various entities that are either submitters or have shown an interest in this proposal, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Can you explain to me, I mean, the district council here obviously has a regulatory function in administering its district plan. So it's taken the approach of getting an independent person to undertake an independent assessment of the proposal. And I understand that because of the separation of responsibilities and so forth. But are you aware, and the regional council has effectively taken that same approach, and the expert opinion of the council, of the regional council witnesses, is that the proposal should be declined in totality. Are you aware of conversations that have been held with the elected body of the regional council to understand what their implications of rejecting the proposal in its totality would mean in economic terms? Has that conversation been part of the discussions or not, in your understanding?
It hasn't been within my ambit, so I haven't been involved in any of those discussions at the political level with the regional council, to be fair. And probably can't really help you too much on that one. I think the district council is slightly different. Actually, no, let's backtrack a little bit. Just at the very beginning of this process in 2018, I did attend a meeting with Ambury Properties, with both the mayor and senior council staff at Waikato District, and it was attended by the then chairman of the regional council as well. So that was my only meeting at which there was a regional council politician attending, and so that was very much the starting point of where the councils might sit, I suppose you'd say. And at the political level, they obviously were talking more to APL representatives than to myself, but certainly expressed support in principle for it.
Okay, well, that's something I can take up with the regional council. I just wanted to understand whether you'd been involved in any of those discussions, and thanks for that clarification. Can I just ask you a little bit more about the planning provisions, and in particular the relationship of the RPS to this proposal? And can you point me to anything in Chapter 6 of the RPS that might be seen as being a directive provision, a bit like King Salmon in reverse, that says, you know, these effects must be avoided. Is there anything that gives us no wriggle room in terms of a decision that we might want to make? Whatever that decision might be.
So,
and perhaps I can give you a for instance, and one of the ones that occurs to me, at least on its face, until you dig a bit deeper, is policy 6.14a, which says new development within certain areas, which includes Huntley, shall occur within the urban limits indicated on map 6.2. So on its face, you look at that and say, well, that says you shall do this, and you've made the distinction in other provisions where it uses the word should. So it's, and I agree with you, it's a lesser test. So that policy 6.14a is directive insofar as it says it shall be located within the urban limits indicated on map 6.2. But then you go to map 6.2 and you look at it, and you look at the title of that map, which I'm just scrolling down to do now. And it says that it's future-proof indicative urban limits. So there's a mandatory requirement, if you like, to be in line with something that's indicative. So it seems to me that even if the intention had been to say map 6.2 is pretty definitive, I don't see how you can, in directive terms, be fully compliant with a map that by definition is only indicative. Do you agree with that?
yes, I do. And I suppose I've just gone back to the general interpretation section of the RPS as well, so because it does adopt terminology. So it says shall has been used where methods are of a directive nature, which is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Where little discretion is intended to be exercised. So not no discretion, little discretion. And where it's intended that district plans shall give effect to the method. So you've got to then look at the method. That, in my view, is you've got a policy and then you've got to look at the method. So what's
okay? No, that's helpful too, because that's in terms of policy 6.14. That's the only residential directive, it seems to me, that's spatially constrained, because the rest of policy 6.14 deals with, in B, it deals with new residential development, but that's numbers and general areas. That's not geographically constrained. And then the rest of it's to do with industrial development, except when you get down to G, where it says where alternative industrial and residential land release patterns are promoted through district plan and or structure plan processes, justification shall be provided to demonstrate consistency with the principles. And I think you've made the point that consistency means broad congruence with, but not compliance with each and every point that's there, simply because some of those matters are in tension with one another. Have I understood that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. In planning terms, I mean, the Transport Agency has made much of the fact that the expressway is a strategic link and it's not to be used, or it's not intended to be used for what you might call local travel. What is there in the planning documents as opposed to the NZTA view of the world, if I could put it colloquially, that seeks to implement that via the district plan? other than general effects on the efficacy of transport links and those sorts of things, e.g. the effects?
Yeah, so the policies on that reflect that position I think are probably policy 6.6, which refers to significant infrastructure.
Yes.
So it ensures particular regard is given to effectiveness and efficiency of existing infrastructure, thereby the Waikato Expressway. I think it was 6.3 was the other one. Oh yeah, 6.3, coordinating growth and infrastructure. Management of the built environment ensures. It ensures investment in existing infrastructure is protected. Obviously, coordination, that's a little bit wider, but it certainly talks about protecting investment in existing infrastructure. So those are the elements that come to mind.
But that doesn't prevent it from being used. It just means don't take all its capacity up, doesn't it? I mean, it talks about efficiency and so forth. There's no directive that says people from Ohinewai shouldn't be on the expressway, even if Ohinewai was to grow. That's is that right, or have I got that wrong?
No, there's nothing in the nothing in the RPS that says that.
What about further down the planning hierarchy? Is there anything that you can specifically refer us to that says actually this proposal fairly and squarely offends the transport provisions in either a regional planning document or a district planning document?
Not in terms of regional planning documents or district planning documents, no.
Okay. Again, I'll take that up with the Transport Agency, but I wanted to get your view first. Can I just ask you a couple of questions about what you talked about verbally, e.g. the provisions themselves, and as mentioned previously, the intention's not to dwell on this in matters of great detail, but just to explore a couple of concepts and bigger picture aspects. When you talked this morning about suggesting that an appropriate way forward was a precinct plan, do I take it to, and you referred in doing that, you referred to Lakeside. Are you saying that rather than have all the residential zone provisions apply and all the provisions that would be appropriate for the Ohinewai proposal, you'd cherry pick, if you like, those aspects of the residential chapter that were appropriate and make it clear that only certain provisions applied within the precinct and certain others did not? Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. So the first part of the exercise would be to ascertain what components of the residential provisions don't need to apply.
Okay, no, I understand. No, that's helpful. I don't want to take it any further than that. I just wanted to understand if that's what you intended when you talked about a precinct, and you've answered that. Thank you. The second question is maybe digging into a little bit more detail, but I just want to understand how you envisage it working. You've got various provisions in the rules, both for land use, and I think it's rule RD7, and I'm using residential as a for instance, but I don't think you need to refer to it specifically. RD7 residential talks about the staging and timing of infrastructure and refers to the table in that section that delineates timing and staging. And also on subdivision, there's a proposed rule RD3 that does a similar thing. The question that I have is that the words in those rules talk about the staging that's indicated in the table or that's specified in the table. But the table itself refers both to a staging, e.g. a sequencing, but it also has years next to them. What I'm trying to understand is whether it's only the sequencing in relation to staging that's important, e.g. before you go from stage 3 to 4, you do what it is that's specified in the table, or is there some timing issue that you're intending apply as well, if you understand my point that I'm making?
It's the sequencing.
Because what's the importance then, and what's the relevance of in table whatever the number is that has I'll just bring it up so that I don't get the wording wrong. And I think the numbering of the table might be wrong, but it talks about infrastructure upgrading, and then there's an upgrade required in one column. And then in the column next to that, it says staging and timing. And it says, for example, that the walking and cycling link is stage 2A -year 3. And that pattern is repeated. What's the relevance of the years in there?
So the years, the reason for the years being there is simply that the years are recorded on the staging plan.
Yes.
Behind that sequence of staging. But the reality is that the years are only really there for context, and in fact the rules are intended to relate the staging to sequencing, not years. It's not like you get to year 4 of development. The key is you get to stage 5A of development. That's what counts.
All right. No, I think I understand that. I think in terms of concept, I'm not 100% sure that the words capture that, but that's a conversation potentially for another day. I'll just leave it at that. My understanding too, in terms of the structure of what you've proposed, is that anything that doesn't accord with the staging plans is a discretionary activity. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Do you think that's the appropriate default, given that the staging of these measures, at least certain of them, is pretty fundamental? Do you think that's protective enough to actually say that the staging plan, in terms of implementing the structure plan, has enough teeth in it to ensure that what's set out here actually will happen, and it won't happen in some sort of only in exceptional type circumstances? Just seems to give you a very big opportunity to say, oh, we've sort of gone away from the staging plan, they're going to do it now completely differently, and that's fully discretionary, which potentially undermines the whole concept of integrating the infrastructure with the rest of the development.
I think there's two elements to that. The first is that staging is notoriously difficult to predict. So in terms of development staging, as you know, it's going to be market-led to some extent. So the actual sequencing of various stages could change. So that's why, in my view, the discretionary activity is essential in terms of being able to potentially advance one stage ahead of another. Because my experience is that 9 times out of 10 there'll be some need to depart from a staging plan developed before development took place. But I think the second point is that if there is key infrastructure that's allocated to a stage, then that is critical that happens at the right time. And I guess my view is that a discretionary activity provision can deliver that, provided it's very carefully prescribed. But I do agree that the emphasis should be on not so much the technical kind of staging as to whether 1A goes ahead of 1B or something like that.
Yes.
The infrastructure is delivered at the right time. That's really the key element, I think.
Okay.
Some thought.
Again, that's a conversation for another day if we get to that point, but I just wanted to raise it now to understand what your thinking was in the drafting. And I think that's all the questions that I have. Let me just double check. That is all I have. Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Thanks for your evidence and thanks for answering the questions so fulsomely. It's been helpful.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes the case for APL in support of its rezoning submission, save as to exercise the right of reply that you mentioned on day one. So we're very grateful for the extremely expeditious way that we've moved through this. We're way ahead of where we thought we would be. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Berry. Which I guess begs the question of what should we do now? We've indicated. I'm just trying to bring it up on my screen. Where is it? Here it is. I think. We've got a schedule that anticipated this session finishing at lunchtime, following which the Transport Agency and the Regional Council would follow. It would seem a shame not to commence with those or with the Transport Agency now, provided that didn't inconvenience them in a major way. Is Ms. Sheard? There she is. Ms. Sheard, are you ready to proceed now?
Yes, we can kick off. I think our experts are all on the call. Is that correct, Louise? Yeah, just double checking everyone got in. I think we're all good. Yeah.
So, and you're happy to proceed now?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, I think that would be helpful. I think we can signal now that we are likely to. Oh, maybe not. Well, let's just see how the afternoon goes. Maybe Mr. Bell, if you can just at least make some preliminary inquiries with some of the submitters that are scheduled tomorrow, whether any of them are available and would like to be on standby for the balance of the day, that would be helpful, just so that we don't end up finishing early and twiddling our thumbs, as it were. So,
yep, I can look into that.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Ms. Sheard. We're in your hands.
Thank you. Well, as we've pre-circulated the legal submissions, I'm not going to read from them. I'm just going to simply take you to and highlight the key points from those in terms of Waka Kotahi's key concerns. And you're going to hear from the expert shortly, but I thought it was worthwhile just highlighting a point of concern from yesterday, that by referring to Waka Kotahi's witnesses as the old guard yesterday, Mr. Berry sought to cast some very high level aspersions on the evidence of those witnesses, which I think potentially calls into question their impartiality. So needless to say, I just wanted to note at this point that the Waka Kotahi experts are all extremely experienced, very senior practitioners in their field. We've got Mr. Swears, who's doing the transportation evidence, and he's got over 30 years experience. We've got Miss Loynes, who has over 20 years experience as a transport planner, both here and in the United Kingdom. And we've also got Mr. Mayhew, who has over 30 years experience in both councils and in planning consultancies. So it's really clear from their evidence that they've got extensive qualifications and relevant experience. And they've carefully prepared the evidence, and they've also appropriately made concessions where appropriate. And they've also diligently participated in expert conferencing. So with that in mind, I'm going to focus very much today on the evidence itself and the facts. So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is Waka Kotahi's statutory duties. I'm looking now at section 3 of my submissions. And as you all well know, Waka Kotahi is the statutory agency tasked with delivering the state highway network throughout New Zealand. It's invested billions of dollars in the Waikato Expressway, and that's been expressly for the purpose of creating a high-speed network that moves freight and people. It serves a really important economic function for New Zealand, as Ms. Loynes is going to outline. And so the Transport Agency's put really considerable effort into this expressway as one of the most significant freight routes in New Zealand, and for the economic benefit of New Zealand as a whole. And as she's going to explain in her evidence, Future Proof grew out of a desire to manage the network for those priorities in accordance with the network management plan. So the second key point that I want to highlight, and this really arises yesterday out of Mr. Berry's submissions as well, is that Waka Kotahi's experts are not opposed to all out-of-sequence development. And it's not disputing the economic benefits that would, result from locating the Sleepyhead factory in this location. However, Waka Kotahi is asking that you consider out-of-sequence development carefully. It shouldn't be development at any cost. This is a substantial rezoning proposal. It's for both industrial and residential development. It's not just a resource consent application for a Sleepyhead factory and the economic benefits that go along with it, but it's a much broader industrial and residential development. So if I now just turn to Waka Kotahi's specific concerns, and the first point that I'd like to turn to, and I'm essentially talking to paragraphs 4.2 to 4.6 of my submissions now. The first point is that the lack of services with the proposal will result in trips by residents to Huntly. And as Mr. Turner noted yesterday, there's no doubt that this would be good for Huntly from an economic perspective. But the problem here for Waka Kotahi is that these trips will be made by private vehicles. Mr. Turner couldn't provide any assurances about the actual uptake of housing by employees. In fact, he actually said that the site had been selected within 1 hour of Auckland so that employees could be shipped in if necessary. So while it might be occupied by local workers, we have no evidence that that outcome will actually occur. And Ambury's arguing that there will be 3 things that would mitigate those trips to Huntly for, your everyday services such as shopping and, if you want to go to the pharmacy or you need to go to the GP or access healthcare or, in fact, to access the high school. First one that they seek to say would mitigate those effects is walking and cycling track to Huntly. Now, Mr. Swears is quite clear in his evidence that he considers that the distance is too far to cycle for regular trips throughout the week, and that's the case even if people were to choose to travel by e-bike. Second, yes, look, there's no dispute that public transport could be provided. I mean, anyone can put on a bus, but the key point here is that the regional council says that actually people would choose to use their vehicles to access Huntly in preference to actually hopping on a bus. And that, I think, is part of the problem, that there simply wouldn't be the demand for that service, so it's unlikely to be effective. And third, there's no evidence that the alternative and less direct route to Huntly that Mr. Inder proposes would ever be used, and Mr. Swears touches on that in his evidence, and I think picks it up again in his summary statement. So turning to paragraph 4.7 of my submissions, the use of the expressway for short local trips is a real issue for Waka Kotahi because it will compromise that strategic function of the expressway for freight and interregional travel. It's not just it's not just the point about capacity that's important. Yes, there is capacity currently on the expressway to cater for this development right now, but it's the ability to cope with the additional freight demands into the future and the cumulative impacts of out-of-sequence growth, both around Ohinewai and in other locations. Added to this, you also need to take into account the fact that car-oriented development also increases carbon emissions. So in terms of the transportation engineering issues, which Mr. Swears covers in his evidence and referred to around paragraph 4.14 of my submissions, Mr. Swears' evidence is that there are considerable challenges with this site, and there are problems with the ITA provisions and the planning provisions, particularly in relation to the residential component. He also notes that in terms of walking and cycling to the local schools, his evidence is that the distance from the residential area is twice the average distance to school, that people are prepared to walk. And in my submission, that evidence is to be preferred over Mr. Inder's anecdotal evidence from a few existing residents. So I guess the question for you as the hearing panel is how you're supposed to assess all of this evidence under the statutory framework. And I'd like to highlight a few of the key factors that Mr. Berry has glossed over. And I'm in section 5 of my legal submissions now.
Thank you.
First, under section 31, you are required to look at the cumulative effects, and that involves both the domino effect in terms of more development around Ohinewai and also more out of sequence development along the expressway. And Mr. Mayhew touches on those issues further in his evidence. Second, a district plan must of course give effect to any MPS. Mr. Berry made a lot of the issue yesterday of how to interpret urban environment. My submission is that the definitions and some of the provisions are quite unclear. And I guess as the first cab off the rank, I guess pretty much in considering this MPS, we need to make the best of the situation that we can in terms of the interpretation. In my submission, Mr. Mayhew's view is to be preferred in terms of that definition of urban environment. He draws attention to the physical separation between Huntly and Ohinewai and labour markets, not being part of a labour market of more than 10,000 people. But really, look, at the end of the day, whether it is part of the urban environment or not is really of very little import, because what the MPS says is that where there's out of sequence development, it should result in a well-functioning environment, and it should also reduce carbon emissions, and the development that's proposed here doesn't achieve either of those outcomes. Next point to turn to is in terms of the RPS, and you're required to give effect to the RPS, and I think the analysis is actually quite simple. Mr. Berry mentioned yesterday that we considered it was a straitjacket for development, and that's quite clearly not true. Witnesses for Waka Kotahi have acknowledged that the RPS quite clearly anticipates out of sequence development, but not at all cost. It has specific requirements that you must consider when you're looking at those proposals. So its objectives and policies set out those requirements, including in particular requirement to protect the value and long-term benefits of regionally significant infrastructure. And with reference to your questions to Mr. Oliver about the directions and the RPS just relating to capacity availability, I think that totally overlooks the function of that infrastructure. The question of what purpose this infrastructure is serving is critical and central to what you need to do to give effect to those policies in the RPS which require protection of the infrastructure. So Mr. Mayhew sets out his views in that regard in his evidence, and as I said, it's critical to look at that function and considering the evidence. Mr. Mayhew also steps us through the alternative land use criteria. Mr. Berry acknowledged yesterday that poor land use and transportation planning integration, car-centric development and development of a dormitory town are important issues under the RPS, But he also argued that at the end of the day, that on the balance of convenience, the balance of convenience still lies with the granting of the plan change, and that we should just deal with it. I'm not sure where that proposition comes from in terms of the balance of convenience. Certainly it doesn't have a basis in the RPS or in law. In terms of the relevance of part 2, Mr. Berry seemed to be saying yesterday that you need to make some kind of judgment as to whether the RPS goes far enough in terms of enabling alternative land release. And if it does not, then you can have recourse to part 2. There's no basis for that argument. First, there's no direct conflict between the NPS and the RPS. They're both relatively consistent in terms of their approach to it. If there's out of sequence development proposed, it can proceed, but it needs to satisfy certain requirements under those alternative land use provisions in the RPS, or equally in the NPS there are directions to require a well-functioning urban environment. Finally, just like to briefly traverse section 32 and the consideration of alternatives. In our submission, the analysis is woefully inadequate in relation to this rezoning proposal. There's the insertion of the new objective into the provisions, which basically directs, well, it does direct industrial development to occur at Ohinewai with supporting commercial and residential components. There's been no analysis as to whether this objective is the most appropriate way to achieve the purposes of the RMA. There's been no comparison against other locations for either industrial or residential development, or a proposal that combines the two, or either of those separately. We don't even have a proper or thorough assessment of the alternative industrial sites that Mr. Turner says Sleepyhead looked at. He made reference to that yesterday, but it was at a very high level. We don't know what criteria they applied or how they assessed it. King Salmon is very clear that an alternatives assessment may be required when you're considering a plan change application where the applicant owns the land. So it's submitted that in this case, because there's an assertion by Ambury that there are no other viable alternatives, and this is out of sequence development, that alternatives assessment is critical. I think I'll leave it there. Those are the key points I'd like to highlight.
Thank you, Ms. Shed. That's helpful. Let's just see if the panel's got any questions. Maybe starting with you, Mr. Marg.
Not at this stage, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton.
No, probably a question later on, but I think just a comment, or perhaps I ask. All the emphasis is being put on the travel between Huntly and the site at Ohinewai. There does not seem to be any reference made to any of the volume of traffic that might travel north. And I'm talking about Tekawhara. I'm well aware that there's a large number of children, for instance, go from Huntly to Ohinewai colleges and education in Tekawhara. There's nothing to say that people from this area mightn't go north as well. But that doesn't seem to be picked up at all. Everything is intended that it all goes to Huntly. I don't really have a comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. I think that's a question that would be best addressed by Mr. Swears or Ms. Lyons. As you observe, I think most of the emphasis has been on the travel to Huntly, I guess, as the closest location, but certainly they'll be able to provide you with some further information regarding Tekawhara.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Fulton. Mr. Kearney?
You're basically relying on, in your legal submissions, on the evidence from your witnesses and in the promotion of that strategy, and also the nuts and bolts of the effects on the network around the site. That's essentially the nub of the case, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the function of the expressway is absolutely critical to the argument. you know, you can put cars on anything. You can put cars on a shared use path if you wanted to. There's capacity there on some of those shared use paths to take cars. But the question is it consistent with the function of that piece of infrastructure? And I think, you know, it's a pretty basic example, probably not a good one, but, you know, that's the argument that we're running here, is that, you know, the strategic function is absolutely critical, and New Zealand has invested billions of dollars into this piece of infrastructure for freight and interregional travel. And I think that is reflected in the policy documents, and that they really do seek to focus growth on existing areas so that you can get some efficiency out of the transportation network rather than spreading it out along the expressway.
Has NZTA objected to any other developments along the Northern Corridor? And can I just put to you Te Kawhata and Pocono?
I'd need to check. I wasn't involved in either of those projects, but I could check with the Transport Agency and get back to you. I'm conscious, I think probably Te Kawhata and probably Pocono as well were probably quite some time ago.
So there's a corridor study been undertaken. At the moment, we don't know what it is, but if you take your position, there should be no new development outside existing areas along that corridor. There's no flexibility whatsoever.
No, I think
because it's the strategic use of the motorway that causes the problem.
No, I think the message from the Transport Agency's witnesses is that each development would need to be assessed on its own merits. I mean, this is a question you can put to those witnesses themselves, but certainly it doesn't mean no development outside the corridor ever. It just means that in each case of out of sequence development, you need to look at, you know, what the potential effects of that rezoning is.
Well, what's the, in this case, you've got a proposal that says, well, we've got an industrial land and we've got a component and we've got a urban component. The industrial component has been chosen by Sleepyhead because it allows for freight to be conveyed much easier from its factory to be located at Ohinewai. Isn't that clearly consistent with your strategy?
Yeah, and I think Transport Agency's witnesses have made it clear that the residential development is the particularly problematic part of this development, that the freight is less problematic.
Well, is it problematic or not? It's inconsistent with the strategy, isn't it?
Well, again, I think that's a question you need to put directly to those witnesses, but my understanding of the evidence is that it is consistent with that freight objective, yes.
All right, yep, okay, thank you.
I don't think I have any questions. Obviously, as you say, Ms. Swears, that it's the evidence that we need to understand, and we haven't heard that yet. So we'll see what arises, and we'll give you the opportunity to summarise or respond once we've heard from your witnesses, if there's anything that you want to clarify for us in relation to your submissions. Could I just ask a question and it's just a procedural question. When is it that Mr. Mayhew is going to be called, given that he's wearing two hats in the proceedings, one for your client and one for the regional council? Was he going to do a cameo and appear twice, or is he going to go in your slot, or is he going to appear in the regional council slot? Can you help us with that?
We were going to put him on right at the end of the regional council's case only once, and that was largely in terms of efficiency. If you did have pressing questions that you felt needed to be answered sooner, then we could put him up sooner. But I think it is more efficient for him just to wrap everything up at the end.
Well, I think given that the two cases seem to me at least to sort of dovetail together, I think that's a helpful suggestion, and I think it was probably the one that we would have made if you'd made a different suggestion, but you haven't, so the point's moot. But I think that would be helpful. So I think we can. Is presumably it's either Mr. Swears or Ms. Lyons, whichever.
Yeah, Miss Loynes is next.
Loynes, I'm sorry.
She's on the line. I guess we've got half an hour for lunch before lunch, so
I think we know use it. Shouldn't we?
Excellent.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
can you turn your camera on? You're not popping up on my screen.
Hello, you should be able to see me. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thanks, Ms. Loynes. I'm going to say good morning because we've got 20 seconds to go until midday, so good morning.
Good morning. Okay, I will just pick up, I guess, on some of those key points that have come out today, and perhaps it's worth me sort of, I won't reiterate all of the strategic functions that we undertake, and obviously you will have read my summary evidence around the key concerns of Waka Kotahi, which really are around the use of the expressway for short local trips and how this site can ameliorate that impact or not, as the case may be. From our point of view and in my evidence, hopefully I haven't laboured this point too much, but it must be understandable to everybody that the key forms of amelioration in terms of local trips on the expressway are effectively a cycle lane that's going to take 30 minutes for somebody to cycle to get to Huntly. Or in the original ITA, there was a PT service that was operating, I think, only in the AM and PM peak, but that might be extended to be hourly during the day. And I don't know where the negotiations have got to on that PT service, but as I'm sure all of you will be aware, that's considerably less convenient than a 10-minute trip by car down the expressway to access these services. And that is a key concern for us, because the origins of the network plan that's quoted in my evidence, and indeed the origins of what was put in the RPS, relate to a board decision that was made in 2008 that effectively agreed funding for the expressway. And if I may, I will submit that 2008 report that included that board decision, because within there is a board resolution that effectively says Hamilton City Council, Waikato District Council and Waipa District Council developing an integrated transport and growth strategy, which includes amongst its aims the avoidance of ribbon development along and congestion of the Waikato Expressway, and is to be included in the regional policy statement prior to the board approving the funding of any further construction phases for the Waikato Expressway projects. So we have had a deep concern about the use of the expressway in terms of ribbon development and unsustainable development locations for a very long time, and this is not a new concern that councils have dealt with. That was reflected because we were a future-proof partner in how that settlement pattern arose, which seeks to ensure that development trips on the expressway are reduced, that development is located in areas where there are existing services that people can use, and that where there is a hope of delivering a multimodal solution. So that's just to draw on that background as to why that protect policy is likely to be sitting in the RPS and is of particular import to us as an organisation. And then the other thing that I think is really important is to just underscore again the strategic importance of this corridor to New Zealand Inc. It is essentially one of only four routes that are classed as national high volume routes in the whole of New Zealand. The other ones are in Canterbury for the most part, and the reason that those Canterbury ones exist is for a similar reason, i.e. at that point in the network in the South Island, pretty much all freight is coming to get to that motorway location to deliver to the ports or to import export. So as you can imagine, that represents a key investment objective for us, and protecting that freight function going well into the future is extremely important. Although there is an effort, I think, to increase the share of multimodal freight movement over time through investment in rail, the reality is that road freight will always form a major component of delivery between the Golden Triangle and between the top of the North Island and the rest of New Zealand. So within my evidence at section 2.8 point D and E, I really underscore that, you know, there's a huge amount of freight that's going to be carried on this route moving forward. And the other point I really want to stress here is there's a real difficulty with trying to make journey time gains in some of the other locations now. So if you think about Drury and if you think about the Southern Motorway, we've invested in lane widening through there, but really all we're kind of doing is dealing with existing traffic demand growth and unreliability on those corridors. So where we've made the biggest gains in terms of improving journey times for freight have been on these sections as a result of a controlled development pattern within those areas. So I think that's another really important point to consider. And just to touch on this point about, well, what is and isn't acceptable to the agency, because you can't protect this corridor ad infinitum against every short distance trip that might occur on it. And I totally accept that point. We can't do that, and we have to accept that it will take traffic in the future. But we also don't want to get into a situation where we don't have any real alternatives to the private car. And the way this site is located really strongly points to that being the problem. We cannot find at the moment sufficient evidence to support the fact that many people will cycle. Cycling in New Zealand is extremely low. It's about 1.7% of mode share. And even in locations such as Ngaruawahia, that percentage is slightly higher than Waikato District, but is still operating at 1.7%. And that is a location which is about 9 k's from a load of employment at the top of Hamilton and already has a very, very beautiful river path that runs along its length to connect it. So I just want to make sure that we're not overemphasizing the likelihood of this cycling to really take the vast majority of trips off the network. Mr. Vincent Quo will deal with the PT aspect of this, but I think upon that largely rests our concern. And the other thing I would say is that for me, part of the role of undertaking the strategic planning that underpins where we develop land is about understanding what the critical point is at which a settlement of a new community makes sense and can be served efficiently and well by alternative modes, and what services should go in to support that community. And I can't emphasize enough that for me, the development of a new community in this location requires that thought, because from a transport agency perspective, we have thousands of calls upon our funding to deliver PT services, to part fund new cycleways, to look at alternative roading layouts, to improve multimodal aspects of development. And those are never going to go away, and you will always be competing at a national level for that funding. And so if the quantum isn't right, and if this doesn't work from that point of view, there's always going to be a struggle to help assist funding these locations. So for me, it's about taking that bigger picture, that wider view, and if we get the evidence base that underpins Waikato 2070, and it says there's no capacity anywhere else within that future-proof settlement pattern, then of course we need to look at new locations, but we need to do that in a coordinated way that really thinks about what that community needs. And I guess upon that, I will leave my submission and ask for questions, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Marg.
Yeah, just a clarification, Ms. Lyons. Just going back to the strategic planning and what you were suggesting around, I guess, this proposition that we're here to consider in the rezoning, are you suggesting that there has not been enough consideration to the effects that this proposition is going to have, or potentially have, on sorry, Karen.
I think the issue for me is if we're creating a new community here, which we appear to be contemplating, 1,100 houses is a lot of people. Actually, what does that mean in terms of that wider area being developed? And as Miss Shared indicated, does this trigger a domino effect that we should have actually had some consideration of around this new community growing more and more and more? And if I may, I'll probably point to an example which might help, I guess, reveal my thinking on this, which is the school itself. So if we do end up with a domino effect here, what we have is a community that's one side of a railway line and an expressway, and a school that's on the other side, and no provision in anybody's land or structure plan for relocation of that school, so that people don't have to travel 2 kilometre to 3 kilometre trip to get to that school. But there's been no consideration of that as part of this. And actually, if you were looking at developing a new community here, you might well consider whether the better place for that school would be on the other side of the expressway. And I guess that's one example that I would choose to sort of highlight.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a couple of questions, Ms. Lawrence. Should the residential component not be built, wouldn't that make it worse? Wouldn't that create a peak hour flow of traffic onto that short segment of the road that you're talking about all the time? I mean, you're talking about if the residential part's built, is creating a community there, but that's going to be a spread over a longer period of the day. Is it likely to be the other way around? And if it's not, you could have a traffic peak hours on that problem, that short bit of road?
Okay, so I guess there's a couple of issues to unravel there. The first one that I would go back to is we currently don't have any real guarantee about how many people are going to live on that site and work on it. There is no tie to the factory, to the housing. The second point I would make, and it was made in my evidence at paragraph 9.35, only 15% of vehicle trips are related to work travel. So I mean, that to most people is somewhat astonishing, but it is in New Zealand, that is the case. So we will still have peak impacts on there, but it's much easier to put in a shuttle between Huntly and the factory to help those factory workers get to the site than it is to try and deal with a load of residential trips. Some people who will be going at 8 in the morning to drop their kids off at school, some people who will be going to Hamilton to work, some people that will be going to Kofodder, some people that will be going even further north. I think that's part of the issue for us, is that the residential has several point impacts. You can't just say, oh, everyone just wants to get to this one place. Whereas with a factory, you stand a slightly better chance of doing that. So it does slightly reduce those transport effects. The other thing I would say is that this is really car dependent, and this is going to be an ongoing issue for governments across the world, which is how do you reduce the carbon effects of this? And it doesn't matter whether they're travelling in the peak hour or in the middle of the day, they're still, if they're driving, producing a carbon impact. Admittedly, in the peak, it can be a lot worse and it's a bigger concern, but it would still be a concern to me that we're locking people into owning a car and using it to get around.
But then wouldn't if there's no residential building there, all the people would have to travel anyway, so therefore I can't see that that's going to be much different. I mean, everyone that's going to work there is then going to have to be car dependent.
So the industrial generates, I can't remember, it's a reasonable number of trips, but every single household would generate around 10 trips a day. So if you put 1,100 houses there and each of those generate around 10 trips per day, that's a significant number of trips. That's probably actually slightly more than the factory would do, although I will check on that in the ITA. But generally speaking, industrial doesn't really generate as many trips as housing does. And again, it's about whether you can really ameliorate those impacts on the expressway. And I would say again that if the factory gets the majority of its staff from Huntly, as seems to be intimated, there'll certainly be a local area that will be ideal for that factory. Then it might be easier for us to undertake a shuttle PT service that just deals with those shift times. You're not trying to deal with people's day-to-day needs, which are wide and varied, and will not just be at Huntly, will probably be at Hamilton as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cooney.
You say in paragraph 7.2 of your evidence that there was a government mode shift from private vehicles to walking, cycling and public transport to reduce private vehicle dependency. That, with a change of government, if that happened, or different personnel in a government, that can change overnight, can't it?
What I would say is that emphasis has changed, but if you look at the GPS that was, I think, even prior to the latest coalition, there's still within that GPS a desire to essentially reduce congestion. And, you know, in urban areas, the only way to really deal with that is to encourage some kind of mode shift. You can't keep building roads forever. You just end up basically knocking down the very businesses that you're trying to service by widening the roads. So I would suggest that, yes, there might be a slight emphasis, but having said that, I don't think it would be massive in urban areas. I would expect to still see any government want to try and tackle that. So yeah, it moves around in terms of its priority, but I don't think it ever goes.
If this was just an industrial proposal and it has the benefits as the Sleepyhead people have said, and Mr. Turner, that it has the benefits of providing easy access for freight, would the NZTA be objecting to it?
So I sort of cover this in section 9.9 of my evidence, where I discuss the fact that the proposal could align with some of the economic outcomes in the network plan. I guess from our point of view, it would be again about, well, how much can we do to reduce the number of trips going to there? And I think that would be an easier proposition for everybody involved for the reasons that I've outlined. So I think we would, the transport impacts are lesser. The development of a factory, which clearly has quite a high import-export sort of part to it, judging by the fact that they want access to the rail siding, and they've talked about the fact that they have this business that crosses New Zealand and Australasia. I would say that, you know, we would really look more favourably upon that because they have a need to get out of these urban areas and onto a really good strategic network. So I can kind of understand that.
Yes, and it's because it's entirely consistent with your strategy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it would still need to look at reducing its effects on the strategic function of the network. So we'd still want to tackle some of those short distance trips again. But as I've said, I think that's easier when you've just got a point factory and a nearby settlement. So we can't fundamentally support something that we haven't been given to see. But what I would say is it's better from the perspective of its alignment with our network plan and the function of that highway.
So if we just cut to the chase here, and we've got a proposal that's on the table that we've been told will generate something like $200 million per annum in economic benefits. It will contribute to the revitalising Huntly, which is a deprived area, and it'll create 2,600 jobs. Now, taking that context, is the NZTA telling us as commissioners that we should turn that down because people that may live at this property hop in their cars and spend 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes driving to Huntly using a new motorway? Is that the case for NZTA, leaving aside Mr. Swears' nuts and bolts, which I can understand, but I'm putting that to you on that basis.
Well, I guess for me, the question becomes, if we allow this to happen here and it's okay, then where isn't it okay? And at what point does the Waikato Expressway become just a mirror image of the Southern Motorway through Auckland, where we've just completely holed all of our capacity? Now, you might say, well, that's okay because it's delivering much needed housing, but I haven't done an assessment of that. And my biggest concern is that we do it once here and then we're under pressure everywhere along the expressway to do that. And I would point again to my evidence, which is it's easy for people to go to places where the roading capacity is high, where we've invested a lot of money to make that roading capacity very high functioning, because then there's no mitigation required. And this is one of the great paradoxes of transport planning and planning, which is by the use of an effects-based system, we are naturally pushing people to locations where they don't have to do anything. And the expressway is an example of that. So I guess I can't say this is, you know, better than the freight need over the next 60 years, because I haven't done that comparison. But what I'm saying is, when is it not going to be acceptable? So we can't support this on that basis, because as far as I can tell, they can't ameliorate their impact, and that is because of their location. It's not because that I think that they shouldn't be delivering jobs. It's not that I don't think their business is very important. It's that where do we end this in relation to this piece of infrastructure that we've spent nearly 4 billion building?
Do you know what the design capacity of the expressway is?
Oh gosh, no, I would say no, and I'm not sure that that's the point at issue for us. What we're consistently trying to point at is there is capacity available on the expressway, but what is it a good use of that capacity to put short distance trips on there that under the current site sort of plans, there is no way of ameliorating that? And where does that end for us in relation to the expressway?
Well, I was just trying to, you say that in a very generic way, and I'm trying to get you to tell me what is the capacity. For example, what is its design capacity? What is the existing traffic volumes at the moment? And how much does this contribute to over and above the existing traffic, to get an idea of the capacity issue? Can't be all reserved for freight, can it?
Oh, no. But I think this possibly might be a better one for Robert to answer than me. But I go back to the point, which is the capacity that's been generated here has been generated to enable Auckland, Hamilton, the Golden Triangle, and the bits in between to grow. That need for that route does not end at 2040. It continues into the future. And the longer we can support the expressway and keep it running efficiently and well, the more freight benefits we get from that. So I can only give you that. If you want to know actual capacities, I would say Robert Swears might be able to answer that. But I think it's a bit of a, what's the best way of describing it? It's sort of it's a notional discussion about, is there enough space? And our argument is there's enough capacity. Is it right to use that capacity in a way that doesn't align with the strategic purpose of that road?
Thank you.
I've just got three hopefully simple questions, Ms. Loynes, that hopefully have simple answers. You've explained to us that one of the drivers of the Transport Agency's strategy is to reduce carbon emissions. And you've then focused on modal shift, e.g. cycling, walking, public transport and so forth. What about the technological solution to that, e.g. the investment that's going into electric cars, for example? I know that doesn't address the strategic use of the expressway point you're raising, but isn't technology going to solve a big chunk of that issue in the medium term anyway? And have you considered that?
Yeah, so I think transport planners always consider that. I think investment in electric vehicles still requires a lot of energy. So the building of those cars, their batteries, all of that stuff is still a huge use of carbon. There are consistent concerns about how rapidly that might roll out to people on low incomes. So how soon they might be able to afford to get on that electric car sort of ride. And I guess from the point of view of whether electric cars ameliorate everything, we're still putting trips on a road, right? So we still have a vehicle that's sitting there taking up space.
Well, I was drawing the distinction between
so in carbon emissions, electric vehicles are better, but they still use energy. So there's still energy required to charge the batteries. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're a huge amount better than combustion engines, but really some of the jury's out on how effective they are in terms of carbon emissions when you consider their manufacture as well.
What would be the difference in effects on the strategic network be if, for example, this factory aspect, and forget the residential for a minute, was relocated somewhere within urban limits in the Waikato? It doesn't matter whether it's at Ohinewai or Huntly or the outskirts of Hamilton or wherever it happened to be. And the workforce that worked there still chose to live in Auckland or moved to Pocono instead because it was a bit closer. There's no guarantee that any of those people would necessarily move, and there's no guarantee that they'd take public transport or anything else. So some of the counterfactuals, it would seem to me, have the potential to be significantly more adverse than a few trips down the expressway. And I don't mean that to be flippant, but I'm expressing it that way to try and make the point simple.
Okay, well, for example, if we located in Huntly, impact number one would be the industrial would be located adjacent to the existing urban form of Huntly. Would also be located off the expressway in terms of its access.
Yeah, but where do those people live if they don't choose to live in Huntly? There's nothing that can make them live in Huntly. They could all stay in Auckland.
No, that's absolutely true. But basically there's, without getting into detailed technical modelling, there does come a point and there's a consistent point at which people will not undertake a commute that's more than a certain journey time. That varies around the world, but in the UK it's an hour. In New Zealand it could be as low as 30 minutes. So, you know, there's a differing tolerance to how far people are willing to travel.
But
and I would suggest
people are commuting from Tikawhata to Auckland now, aren't they?
So yes, but not in enormous numbers, right? So you have to think about everything that we do in transport is based on gravity modelling, and the reason for that is that it is well recognised that gravity modelling normally quite well represents how people travel. So there comes a limit to how far people will travel. If you live in South Auckland, and for example, the new factory is at Te Kaiwhara, for some people that commute will be too much, and they will just look for another job in South Auckland because there's more jobs in South Auckland and there is choice of how you might travel in South Auckland. So to a degree, you could go, oh, well, more people might travel down there, but equally less people might want to work there from South Auckland because it's much further away. So it's a really hard question to answer because to a degree, that's the type of modelling that maybe would have been useful for our assessment of this site, but it's not done. So I can't answer the question.
So what's the, I mean, in terms of, you've talked about commute lengths, and I don't know too many of the details about it, but this recently announced train service from Hamilton to Auckland, my understanding is that that's about a 2-hour trip or 2-hour plus trip each way. And presumably that's had the support of transport planners to do that. But doesn't that fly in the face of what you're trying to say? Aren't you being very selective in the way that you propose some of the benefits and disbenefits of this proposal? Because transport planners are saying we need to make it simple for people to be able to commute from Hamilton to Auckland for work. And yet with the current proposal, as I understand it, you've got to change trains at Papakura. The two aren't necessarily integrated fully, and it takes at least 2 hours each way. And people are expecting people to do that on a daily basis. I mean, that doesn't seem logical in terms of the argument that you're putting forward.
So, but that's built around the fact that there are people undertaking some of those journeys now. And just to be clear, that service is for 2 trains in the morning and 2 trains in the afternoon. It's a relatively limited starter service, and it will test really what the appetite for that is. I think in the long run, that will need to be more heavily invested. But,
okay. All right, no, I understand.
You know, for me, it's a bit, you know, these are all quite esoteric arguments, and I guess you can argue either way. But I would go back to the point that the expressway was built to deliver a certain function. And if you're building something, and by virtue of its location, it's quite hard to get people to use alternative modes, then you've kind of put yourself in a difficult position.
Okay, I understand that point. Can I just ask you one final question? You've made mention again of the strategy and the avoidance of ribbon development. I just wonder, is this ribbon development of the sort that statement contemplates? This isn't about sort of incremental shift of things sort of dribbling their way out of zone, if you like, you know, and establishing whole incremental step by step development, house by house or little subdivision by little subdivision. This is a sort of a fundamentally bulky sort of an enterprise, if you like, that's of a scale and importance that I wouldn't have thought fit the normal definition of what ribbon development means. Do you have a comment on that?
My comment on that would be that if you think about the old state highways, ribbon development was a really clear concept because people just built accesses straight onto the state highway.
Yes.
The point of the expressway in terms of limiting its accesses is to almost try and prevent that to a degree. But what I would also say is that when you look at what's contemplated in Waikato 2070, effectively this site just bolts onto the back of Huntly, and Huntly's already 8 kilometres long. So this is now going to be a 14 kilometre long piece of ribbon development with access off one of our interchanges. So I would say that essentially, again, what we're unlocking the gates to here is just build around every single interchange that's available on the expressway, because there's loads of capacity there. And how is that any different to what we used to do in the past with state highways and just putting accesses onto them? I don't see that there's a massive distinction.
Okay, no, I understand that. I suppose the point is, though, future-proof anticipates Huntly growing to the north. And yes, it's not directly associated with an interchange, and I get that. But is it really any different? Huntly moving north, or there being something that moves from the north back towards the south? I don't really understand what the difference is. People that were living, for example, on the west side of the river, in the identified growth area to the north, are still going to be a long way from the Huntly CBD. And they're going to be a long way from Hamilton in the base and all those sorts of things. So aren't they going to be taking the sorts of commutes that you're concerned about in their day-to-day lives anyway?
Yeah, but if you think about where that would be in Huntly, for the most part, that's off the strategic network. So those trips may well occur, but they'd be occurring on local roads and streets. There is also, I guess, a long-term issue around, once you get to a certain level of population, you can sort of get to a place where you can deliver more multimodal components for those people. And also, if you think about the commute now, if you were to cycle from Ohinewai to Huntly to get to the town centre, you would actually at some point be cycling through potentially an area where there isn't anything. There is no urban form. It's essentially a green patch. Now, from a septic point of view, for women or for young children or for all of those reasons, that's actually not a very good environment. So again, look, there's some merits in
pros
the
and cons.
approach,
I get
there's
that.
pros and cons, yeah.
Yeah,
and
I understand that.
It's very finely balanced.
Okay, thank you. No, that's helpful, and appreciate the answers to the questions. It's been helpful to us. Thank you. Which I think conveniently brings us to lunchtime. We'll resume after lunch with Mr. Swears. And should we start at, what time do we need? If we start at 1:15, would that suit people? Does that suit the panel?
Yes.
All right. This is one that you do need to exit from this call. There's a new link for the session this afternoon. So if you could please disconnect and we'll